Let's talk disease, excess, magic and might. Time for a review of the forces of the Chaos Gods in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos Demons, and we're going to be doing a full review of the new Codex for 9th edition. The Demons book has certainly been very long awaited, the second last of all of the 8th edition codexes to get a new update, and it does look like it's going to be bringing a decent enough power boost to the Ruinous forces. In this review we'll be focusing on the core rules of the army, and seeing what the forces of the Dark Gods can do in game. Overall the book does look far stronger than the one it will be replacing. Just about every datasheet's got stronger. There's a bunch of rather scary rules, including things to deploy demons right out of the warp, and demon invul saves to keep them safer, and plenty of fun and flavourful things besides. So here's a rough overview of the contents of Codex Chaos Demons then. Of course, besides the army's rules, we also have the Crusade rules, the miniature galleries, and the lore. Today though, I will be focusing on the way that the Demon's army works. Interestingly, the book is rather broken down into the various different Chaos Gods, rather than having a generic section for army rules, then loads of datasheets. It actually breaks down the book in a few generic rules, and then almost all the rules in the book are split between the 4 major deities, with their own sections on warlord traits, relics, stratagems, and everything else. For the main faction rules, some of the interesting mechanics are these new demon saves, being able to deep strike in some really interesting and weird ways, malefic weapons, which are a common profile throughout the book, and a rule called demonic terror, as demons are rather scary to the mortals. There's some really quite fun allies rules. Fielding 25% or less of your force of demons will now be a lot easier. There's an army-wide Warpstorm special rule, giving you extra benefits to your forces as you go forward or dealing out some mortal wounds. Then for each of the book's gods, there's the standard choices for most armies in 40k, 6 warlord traits, 6 relics, between 6 to 8 stratagems, and 6 psychic powers, though obviously not for Khorne. The points cost upgrade for the book are the Exalted Greater Demon traits. These previously cost CP, now they cost points, and you've got 3 options for each. And then each book goes through its own Demons datasheets, most of which have got some really quite big stat and damage boosts, though in general the trend has usually been to go up higher in points than they cost before. A few datasheets have made their way into the book for the first time, things like Be'lakor and the Skull Altar. They were previously in supplements. Then after the 4 major deities, there's a Book of the Warp, where there's the unaligned datasheets for Be'lakor and Soul Grinders and the Demon Prince, the Noctic Discipline of Shadows that Be'lakor and his army use, and then Be'lakor's disciples, the Army of Renown, and the stratagems that you can use with them. Finally, when books get redone, things get given but things get taken away. For a start, several things that aren't here are a lot of the datasheets. The variant Bloodthirsters just got merged into one standard sheet, the same as the other greater demons. Chaos Furies are sadly no longer a thing. Brimstone Horrors now can't be fielded as their own troops choice, they can only be fielded by splitting the other horrors down. And they didn't add those Sinessa and Dexessa Slaanesh twins from Age of Sigmar, technically because they're fragments of Slaanesh, which didn't happen in 40k. It's also interesting that the faction-specific secondaries didn't come up in the Demons Codex. All the other 9th edition codexes have had their own secondary objectives printed in them. I believe that they've probably just deliberately left them out of the Demons Codex, and are going to be just putting them in the Grand Tournament mission packs from now on. Still though, I think it's a bit of a weird choice, given that every other 9th edition codex has had them. Otherwise, a few core army rules have gone away. The individual gods' demons don't really have any sort of unique special rules, like Slaanesh fighting first or Khorne getting extra attacks. All those things are pretty much just baked into the unit's profiles now, so you don't get any variance. The demon loci rules are also gone, so no more +1 strength buff from demon heralds, though their buffing abilities are still rather good, and none of the god-specific loci either sadly. Perhaps the biggest loss out of those is the Slaanesh advance and charge, though in general it is kind of compensated for by higher movement characteristics. Sticking with what is here though, let's talk about the core rules. First up, the entire army now has a Legion's Demonica keyword. That's to differentiate these guys from just generic demon things in other books, things like Death Guard demon engines for example. And most of the synergies do play off that keyword now, so you're going to have not really much cross-faction synergy with Chaos Space Marine demon units anymore. Kind of to be expected, Games Workshop's trying to keep the buffs acting on the units that they're mainly intended for. Next up, for detachment restrictions and benefits, If you include a greater demon in the army or Be'lakor, it must be your warlord, but that rumoured cap on the number of greater demons that you could field per detachment doesn't seem to be there, so if you want a Khorne detachment with 3 Bloodthirsters, you still can. As well as that, I guess to ease pressure on the HQ slots, each greater demon that you field allows you to field 1 Herald slot free. Just about everything that isn't a greater demon has the Herald keyword besides Demon Princes, I think, and that's quite a nice touch as the Demon HQ section is really quite bloated. In the detachments, most of the troops are gaining OBSEC, but not the swarms and not blue horrors on their datasheets. The troops all cost a fair amount more points as well. You really have to field some big meaty units of lesser demons. Finally, for detachment things, you can also field demonic allies, which we'll get onto, but basically it's super easy to add chaos demons to other chaos lists now. Next up, we've got the demonic keyword. This is a special rule on just about every single demon datasheet, and it gives them a whole host of special rules. First up, and one of the major changes for the book, is the demon invulnerability save. This is kind of the super invul mechanic, armor saves that can't be modified either positively or negatively, and it basically has the effect of being a save that even works against things that would ignore invul saves. Each one has 2 profiles, one for range and one for melee. The one against range is better or equal on just about every single unit. If you want to kill demons efficiently, you want to engage them in combat, but in general that's where they want to be anyway, so it's kind of a mixed blessing. Some of the different gods have quite different saves this way. In particular, Tzeentch is a bit weird with the 3+ save against range and the 6+ against melee, so Tzeentch armors are just really easy to clear in combat, but really hard to clear for ranged units. Next up, they've also got a rule called Demonic Manifestation. This one's really quite a big rule. Just about every demon unit can set up in Deep Strike Reserve now, but then instead of just the set up 9 inches away from the enemy, there's actually 4 different ways that you can choose to set up. You can only use the last 2 of these 4 if you're running a pure demons army without allies. First up, you can just come anywhere 9 inches away from the enemy in general, but the other ways are ways to reduce that. First up, if you set up within 6 inches of something with the Warp Locus keyword, some of the unique greater demons, the fortifications, and a couple of other things, then you're allowed to set up anywhere greater than 6 inches away from the enemy, so basically popping up next to a Warp Locus will allow you a super easy charge. Next up, if you choose to arrive from reserve within your own deployment zone, you can set up anywhere that's greater than 3 inches from the enemy, so really get the jump on them very easily there. And finally, and perhaps most intriguingly of all, you can set up anywhere on the board that is the number of inches away that the enemy has of a leadership characteristic. So say for example, if you had Orc Boys with leadership 7, you could set up 7 inches away from them, or if they happen to be affected by a -1 leadership thing, then it'd be setting up 6 inches from them. Basically, demons are just going to be able to jump out of the warp and absolutely maul something. It really does look like they could be a very powerful deep strike attack army. What makes that rule even more potent is that they get a rule called Demonic Terror as well. Just about all demon units have a -1 leadership and -1 combat attrition debuff aura. Any enemy units within 6 inches of them get that debuff. Leadership shenanigans are only kind of meaningful against certain enemy armies, but just to have that going off passively on around about every single unit is a really nice trait. Finally, all the demon units also get affected by the Warpstorm, provided you are a pure demons army, and we'll get onto that. Finally, there's a few common things on a fair few datasheets. There's a malefic weapon type in the Codex, which is an interesting sort of melee attack. A few weapons are designated as malefic. You make a number of attacks at a set profile, and that profile can't be modified, so it sounds like it might be resistant to things like -1 damage, which is kind of interesting. Several of them tend to be fairly minor attacks, things like Nurglings on a Great Unclean one, Bloodcrusher Steed attacks with damage 1, but there are some quite threatening things like the Keeper of a Secret's claws, or the Screamers that are attached to the Tzeentch chariots. Next up, they mention allegiance units. The Soul Grinder and the Demon Prince must pick a god out of their allegiance keyword. Tzeentch, Khorne, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, you can't be unaligned. And finally, one of the common themes for the books are icons and instruments. They're free in all units now for demons, you don't have to pay points for them, and they'll give your lesser demons and demonic cavalry ignores combat attrition modifiers and +1 leadership, and both the keywords allow some handy things like doing a stratagem and having some additional Warpstorm benefits. A whole bunch of stuff there. The gist is that demons can pop up from the warp very close to you. Their saves are generally going to make them hard to take down at range. They're going to give you leadership debuffs, and there's plenty of other stuff that apply to certain datasheets. While we're on the subject of detachments and things, you can field demons as demonic allies. It basically allows you to field 25% of the army as demons without ruining the allied army's rules, though weirdly it works with power level rather than points, even if you're playing a points game. If you take 25% or less of your army's power level worth of demons, then they all gain the Agents of Chaos keyword, and that means for armies like Chaos Knights or Chaos Space Marines, they won't break things like faction-specific secondaries, or your army-wide special rules like the exploding sixes for Chaos Marines. Really quite fun. You'll obviously still have to pay the command point cost of having additional detachments, but it could allow you access to some pretty powerful and different units. Having Chaos Knights with easy access to infantry could be a different take on them, and Demon Allies look like they'd work really well with certain Chaos Marine armies, say like Night Lords with their extra source of -1 leadership. The rule also specifically calls out certain legions as well, basically the 4 god-specific Chaos Space Marine legions, Thousand Sons, Death Guard, World Eaters, and Emperor's Children. They're all specifically called out not to lose their own special rules if they ally with demons of their own god. The reason for that is the Thousand Sons and Death Guard books make no mention of Agent of Chaos. It basically just confirms that, say, you can have Thousand Sons and keep your Kabbalistic rituals and secondaries, while you still include some Tzeentch demons that they've summoned. Really quite fun. That's going to make Chaos list building a bit more interesting, I think. That means that if you want to bring along some fun summoned demons, then you can. Next up we have the Warpstorm. This is the pure army special rule. If every single unit in your army is a Legion's Demonica one, Agent of Chaos or Unaligned, then you get this ability, and you get to basically put some powerful abilities on your troops. The way it works is at the start of each battle round you roll 8d6. For each 4+ that you roll, you generate a Warpstorm point, though there are a few other ways to gain them in-game. It was rumoured previously that including more gods might reduce this total, but that doesn't seem to be the case. You get 8d6 regardless. Then when you've generated your total, I'd guess you'd average around about 4, though you might get more or less due to good or bad luck. You basically have them as a resource for the battle round and can spend them on various different abilities. There's 8 generic ones and then 3 specific ones per Chaos God. You can use them all multiple times per game, but no more than once per battle round. Any Warpstorm points that you don't spend are lost at the end of the battle round, but there are a couple of abilities to allow you to retain them if you couldn't quite spend them all. These ones are the 8 generic ones. First up for 5 Warpstorm points, there's Dark Invigoration. This one allows you to heal demons basically. Each unit on the board heals D3 wounds or regenerates D3 1 wound models if they lost them from the squad. You use this in your morale phase, and any of the units that you regenerate don't count as having been slain for morale purposes. It's a very pricey one at 5 Warpstorm points. A lot of the time you're not going to be able to get that, but it seems like a pretty decent one, say maybe turn 2 or 3, when a lot of your units might have taken damage but maybe not been killed. Next up, for 3 Warpstorm points, there's Primeval Terror. At the start of your turn, you subtract an additional -1 leadership for units in Demonic Terror range. That is getting pretty meaningful there. -2 leadership within 6 inches is going to give your opponent more chance of failing. Next, there's 3 Warpstorm points, Magnified Glory. Your units get +3 inches to their auras. I believe that would count their Demonic Terror as well, so it would make that go a bit further, but could be handy for some of the HQs too. Next, for 3 Warpstorm points, there's Descending Shadow. I think this might be one of the best ones, to be honest. At the start of enemy shooting, everything gets -1 to hit if it's greater than 12 inches away from your army. That's going to be really punishing to things like Guard or Tau, perhaps. Seems to be about one of the most guaranteed ways of getting good value out of this rule. Next, there's some cheaper ones. 2 Warpstorm points for Music of the Warp. You get +6 inches to your Demonic Terror range for instrument keyword units. I feel like pushing out a -1 leadership aura at just an extra 6 inches probably isn't usually going to be worth it. Feels a bit niche to me. Next, and again for 2 Warpstorm points, there's Malicious Misdirection. Again, super niche in my opinion. You'd use it in turn 3 if your opponent is bringing in any units from Strategic Reserve, and they can only set them up as if it were turn 2. If it matters, I guess it could be annoying, but a lot of armies don't even use Strategic Reserve in the first place. Next, for 2 Warpstorm points, there's Otherworldly Tread. You use this in movement or your charge phase, and you ignore move, advance, and charge modifiers. Perhaps a little bit pricey for what it is, maybe not too bad if you're just about to charge into some difficult terrain. And finally, for 2 Warpstorm points, there's Insidious Whispers. You use this in your opponent's psychic phase, and all psychics within 12 inches perils on any double, not just double ones or double sixes. This one could be a pretty disruptive one against things like Thousand Sons or Grey Knights. If you can get stuck into their army and they have a lot of units within 12 inches of you, then that could actually deal a fair few mortal wounds or have them second guessing themselves. Out of these ones, I do feel that some of them are maybe a bit more useful than the others. Descending Shadow looks really good. Dark Invigoration is excellent, though you do have to have 5 Warpstorm points for it, and maybe otherwise just extending a bit of Demonic Terror doesn't really hurt. It does seem that most of the damage dealing ones are locked to individual gods. Speaking of which, here they are. Each god has 3 of them, and they're unlocked by taking a detachment of that god's units. Auxiliary supports, super heavy auxiliaries, and fortifications don't count though. First up, for the Blood God, we have 4 Warpstorm points, Fury of Khorne, army-wide +1 attacks, though it only applies to one fight phase, either yours or your opponent's, not both. Still though, a really good buff. Dangerous Bloodletters going from 2 attacks to 3 is very nice, seems like a guaranteed way to inflict more hurt. For 2 Warpstorm points, we have Burning Terror. This one's a shooting phase 1, and you roll 1d6 for each unit within 24 inches of your forces, and not wholly taking cover in area terrain. For each roll of a 6, they take d3 mortal wounds. I guess maybe could be an interesting scattergun one to apply if you happen to have a lot of units forward, and you've also got some spare Warpstorm points to burn. Not exactly spectacular damage dealing though. Lastly for Khorne, for 4 Warpstorm points there's Overwhelming Force. On a 4+, your opponent can't fall back from you. This one is really quite a big investment, but on the other hand, it could be absolutely brutal at the right time. Say, for example, if you're fighting a shooting army that has to kill your Bloodthirster at range, and then you manage to lock the enemy in combat with it, so they won't be able to shoot it because it's still locked up. For Tzeentch, they have 3 really quite decent buffs. There's 4 Warpstorm points for Deluge of Fire for +1 ballistic skill. Fairly nice on horrors, though it won't help flamers, which are perhaps my favourite shooting units. There's 3 Warpstorm points for Sorcerous Winds, +1 to cast, and the change powers are very nice indeed. And there's 1 for 3 Warpstorm points for Rampant Mutation. 6 is to wound in melee, deal 1 mortal wound to a maximum of 3 per enemy unit. It's not terrible, but largely the Tzeentch units aren't really all that great in combat. I guess if you're fielding 3 big units of Screamers, then maybe it could be worth it. But still, I'm not sure you're going to get crazy amounts of damage out of that even then. On to Nurgle, and for 4 Warpstorm points there's Swarming Instincts, +1 to hit in melee, a nice generic melee boost which would be very nice on Plague Bearers or things like the Plague Drones perhaps. For 2 Warpstorm points there's Plague of Rust, that one's an extra AP -1 versus vehicles in melee. Some armies in 40k are all vehicles like knights, that will be great against them for just 2 points I think. For 2 Warpstorm points there's Wave of Sickness. Every enemy unit within 12 inches of a Nurgle unit rolls 1d6. 6s cause d3 mortal wounds, kind of similar to the Khorne one. You get slightly less range on it, but the cover thing doesn't make any difference. Then finally for Slaanesh, for 4 Warpstorm points we've got Mesmerizing Dance. That's fight first, and if there's lots of ongoing combats it could be good. For 3 Warpstorm points there's Lightning Speed, +1 to advance and charge, could be very nice out of Warp Strike. And finally, for 2 Warpstorm points, there's Dark Hallucinations. If the enemy does an action within 12 inches of a Slaanesh unit, roll 2d6 versus their leadership, and if it's higher then the action immediately fails, and they take d3 mortal wounds. I guess if you know that your opponent's going to be doing some vital secondaries, that could be okay, particularly with Demonic Terror. In reality though, I bet that's not going to be used all that much. These god-specific ones do kind of incentivize you to build fairly heavily around one god, as otherwise they just might not be all that exciting with one god's units just only getting the benefits of these and the rest of your army not getting them. I think plenty of them are pretty usable though. The +1 attacks and can't fall back both seem good for Khorne. I'd say perhaps the +1 to cast thing is quite good for Tzeentch, that might be the best one there. The Nurgle one, I'd either say the +1 to hit in melee or extra AP versus knights. And for Slaanesh, I'd say probably one of the first two. Maybe +1 to advance and charge is generally going to be quite handy for a melee focused faction. Moving on, let's get into the actual Chaos deities themselves then. First up we have the Plague God of Nurgle. I will go through the army rules and then go through their datasheets. For the warlord traits in the book, each god gets 6 of them, the heralds can take the first 3, and annoyingly you're only ever going to get 1 warlord trait out of the book. Unlike most other codexes, there isn't a stratagem that allows you to take extra ones. For the Nurgle traits, one of them is Heaving Mass for +2 wounds, not a huge durability increase I think. There's Acidic Ichor, each time a melee attack causes a wound on your unit, an enemy unit suffers 1 mortal wound on a 4+. Horticulous Slimux will get that one, and it does seem pretty good on a Great Unclean one to be honest. If your opponent has to damage them in melee, then they're going to deal quite a lot of mortal wounds in return. Next there's Virulent Touch. Melee attacks auto-wound the enemy, but not versus Titanics. Epidemius will get that one, and it does seem a really quite solid buff to a Great Unclean One's combat attacks. Next up, Plaguefly Hive gives you a 6-inch aura of making enemy units -1 to hit in melee, plus they can't do actions. An okay combat debuff, I suppose, would keep you a little bit safer there. Overwhelming Fecundity gives you unmodified wound rolls 1 to 3 always fail against your warlord. It maybe isn't going to help the Great Unclean One with their crazy toughness of 9, not that much is going to be wounding them on 3s, but maybe it could be alright on one of the little guys if you wanted a durability boost. And finally we have Pestilent Miasma. At the start of the fight phase, enemy units engaged with the warlords take a mortal wound on a 2 to 5, or D3 on a 6, and Rotigus the unique Great Unclean One gets that. Out of these I do feel that plenty are pretty underwhelming. I'd say maybe Virulent Touch for the auto wounds thing is really quite solid, and otherwise Acidic Ichor seems like it could be nice on a Great Unclean One, though it does rely on your opponent actually trying to kill them in combat. Next up we've got 6 relics. The Horn of Nurgle's Rot is used after the bearer fights. For each model that your characters manage to kill in the fight phase, you regenerate a Plague Bearer on a 4+ to 1 core unit within 18 inches. Could be a fun way for a few free models, probably seems like it's going to be used on a Great Unclean One, and I guess nothing else. The Entropic Knell gives you a command phase debuff. You pick one enemy unit within 12 inches, it can't use its auras, and you count as half models for objectives. Kind of annoying that this one has to be used in the command phase, I think. It means that you might not be in range of the things that you need to be, though I guess it might swing an objective if you're very, very lucky. Next, the Tome of 1,000 Poxes is a Psyker upgrade. The Psyker model knows another power from the Warpstorm discipline, though they can't cast anymore. And if you cast any spell exactly on a 7, then it can't be denied. Not too bad, that's going to happen 1/6 of the time on 2d6. But still, I kind of class it as a minor psychic upgrade rather than a major one. I guess it gives you a bit more flexibility. Next is a relic weapon called Corruption. It can be applied to any one weapon and it gives you +1 damage, and the enemy can't use any ignores wound rolls. Again, that would certainly make a Great Unclean One a bit fightier in melee, provides a way of countering things like Catan and Abaddon and other things that can't take more than a certain amount of wounds. Effluvior is a relic Plague Flail, a 7-inch attack at assault 3d3 and strength +1, AP3 and damage 3, plus excess damage isn't lost, so that really means it could clear out a bunch of enemy infantry very quickly indeed. The standard Plague Flail is only damage 2, so it's a fairly decent upgrade. Finally we've got the Endless Gift. At the start of your command phase you regenerate wounds equal to the battle round's number. So if you were damaged in the first turn, when you get to turn 2 you'd be regenerating 2 wounds, I guess. Could be handy, that could make it kind of painful to kill something like a Great Unclean One in later rounds. Overall, I'd say that most of these do look pretty decently usable. I don't really feel like any of them are just super stand out though. Most of them may be just pushing a Great Unclean One to be used in slightly different ways. Next up we've got the Nurgle Stratagems, and there's 8 of them. First one for 1 or 2 CP is Revolting Constitution. A Plague Bearer keyword unit gets Transhuman Physiology, 1 to 3 always fail to wound them, and it's 2 CP if the power level is 12 or more, which is relevant for the Plague Drones. A nice extra toughness boost to have on hand there, nice for Plague Bearers standing on objectives. For 1 CP there's Chortling Moraine. This one's for that unique Sloppity Bilepiper Herald. You use it in your shooting phase and you target an enemy unit within 6 inches of the Bilepiper. You roll 1d6 per model in that unit, and for every result that exceeds their toughness value, they take 1 mortal wound to a maximum of 6. You can only use it once, and it does seem like quite a threatening thing that could really damage some toughness 3 infantry. If you manage to use this on something like, say, 10 Sisters of Battle, you could well be killing 5 of them. Situational but quite nasty. For 1 CP there's Pestilent Inspiration. The Nurgle Psyker knows all the powers from the Warpstorm discipline this turn, so it means that you could cast different ones if you like. Seems like that could be handy in a pinch to get a power that you wouldn't usually have access to. For 1 CP there's Relics of the Great Garden. The standard 1 CP per extra relic, you can use it twice in Strike Force, and as I mentioned there's no Warlord trait equivalent to this, so you're only ever getting one of those, likely on a Great Unclean One if you're running Nurgle. For 1 CP there's Slime Trail. This one is for Mr. Slimemucks or the Beasts. It prevents enemies from falling back from them on a 4+, which could be quite disruptive. For 2 CP there's Swarming Flies. -1 to hit for any Nurgle unit. You can use it in the shooting or the fight phase, though I think for 2 CP it is pretty on the pricey side. You probably want to target on something with bad ballistic skill but high damage. For 1 CP there's Crushing Bulk. This is a Plague Drone, Beast or Great Unclean one charging in. You get D3 mortal wounds on a 6+ per charging model, and the Great Unclean one adds 3 to the result. If it gets a 9 then it's D3 plus 3 wounds. Pretty low damage output that one. I guess sometimes some mortal wound impact hits might be helpful though. Finally for 1 CP there's Plague Banner. This is the Nurgle Icon one, so for Plague Bearers or drones, when you make melee attacks against enemy units, you cause a mortal wound on a wound roll of 6. That really seems like quite a significant damage increase, to be honest. If you want some Plague Bearers to actually be threatening in combat, that seems like a pretty reasonable way. Overall, some of the demon stratagems do feel a little bit more limited compared with some of the generic ones that they had before, say +1 to your save somewhere in the Codex. I think having them all split out between the gods is a bit of a weakness, to be honest. Out of these, the Plague Bearer Transhuman Physiology looks good, as does the Mortal Wound one, and there's quite a few that could be situationally useful, say the No Falling Back one, or the Knowing All the Psychic Powers. Both of those could be handy. Next up we've got the Nurgle Psychic. This one's the Warp Rot Discipline, and there's 6 powers. First up there's Stream of Corruption, Warp Charge 6 and 12-inch range. The closest unit takes D3 mortal wounds, or D3 plus 2 if there's 11 or more models in the unit. I guess could be a nice one to flex to with that stratagem if you happen to be fighting hordes. Next there's Fleshy Abundance, Warp Charge 7 and 18-inch range. One Nurgle core unit gets +1 toughness, so that could be toughness 6 Plague Bearers or toughness 7 drones. Next there's Nurgle's Rot, Warp Charge 7 and 6-inch range. You roll 2d6 for every unit within that range. If it's more than their toughness, they take d3 mortal wounds, or if it's double their toughness, they take d6. With an aura effect like that, that looks like it could be okay on a Great Unclean one. It's got a big base, so you might be able to catch multiple units. The Shriveling Pox is Warp Charge 6, 18-inch range, and it makes one enemy unit -1 toughness. A really quite nasty debuff that one. It's going to make them a lot easier to kill. Next there's Virulent Blessing, Warp Charge 6 and 18-inch range. Nurgle core units get +1 damage on their melee weapons. Again, seems fairly solid for making things like Plague Bearer melee actually slightly scary. Maybe more relevant on the Plague Drones, which do seem like a more credible melee threat overall. Finally we've got Malodorous Paw, Warp Charge 8 and 18-inch range. One enemy unit can't do actions, it fails any ones that it's doing currently, and it also loses OBSEC. Messing around with objective secured can often be a way to gain some victory points. Doesn't seem like a bad one to have in the arsenal. Overall, I would say that most of those seem pretty usable. I think perhaps the Shriveling Pox seems to be a particularly handy one for making an enemy unit die a bit easier. I think you could find a use for most of them though, and even if you just wanted some more damage streaming out of a Great Unclean one, Stream of Corruption doesn't seem terrible. Speaking of which, let's get onto the actual Nurgle Demon units then, and we'll start off with the Great Unclean one themselves. All the greater demons got significantly more dangerous and tougher, but they also went up in points a bit. The Great Unclean one is 300 points, 40 points up from the base cost that you could get for the other one for, but now all the loadouts cost the same. You don't have to pay more for the Plague Bell or anything like that. Statline wise, he's really quite beefy, a 7-inch move, strength 7, a big toughness 9, which is an unusual one, a massive 22 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 10, and a 5+4+ demon save. This thing is going to be monstrously hard to put down now. Toughness 9 with essentially a 4+ envelope range is really scary, particularly with that many wounds. Bear in mind that Nurgle doesn't have the 5+ disgustingly resilient save anymore. That's just been folded into more toughness and more wounds across the board it would seem, but in general they do seem to be tougher than they were. Otherwise he's still got 2 casts and 1 deny. He gained a reroll once to hit aura for Nurgle core units, the same as the other greater demons there, and he's got some solid buffs to his weapons as well. He's gained a Putrid Vomit attack, a 12-inch attack at Assault D6, Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 1, auto hitting the enemy. Not bad for a little bit of anti-infantry damage there. And then in terms of his options, a base he comes with a Bile Sword and a Plague Flail. The Bile Sword is the main melee option. It gives you +1 strength, so strength 8, AP 3 and damage D6, and 6s to hit auto wound the enemy. Otherwise it's strength 7, AP 3, damage 1 and double the attacks. The Plague Flail is a short ranged weapon, 7 inches, assault D6 +3, strength user, AP 3 and damage 2, so that one will be quite nice at clearing elite infantry. Then you've got a few options. You can swap the Bile Sword for a Plague Bell if you want. Strength 8, AP -1 and damage 2 melee, so certainly a fair bit worse there, but you do get a fun command phase ability, resurrecting D3 Plague Bearers or 1 Plague Drone from the dead. I'm afraid you can't be setting up Death Guard Mephitic Blight Haulers anymore. Those days have gone, I'm afraid. Otherwise, you can choose to swap the Plague Flail for a Bile Blade. That one's Strength 7, AP 3 and damage 2. You get to re-roll the wound rolls with it, but the main reason that you'd want to take it is that you can voluntarily take 1 mortal wound on yourself for a +1 to cast. Not bad if the Great Unclean One wants to be a bit more of a psychic powerhouse, I suppose. I think for me though, I think I'd probably be tempted by the Bile Sword and the Plague Flail. Just getting more damage on a very, very tanky model seems good, and he's still got some decent utility with his buffs and casts. Finally, he's got 3 options for exalted upgrades. 25 points for Bountiful Gifts, which allows you to retain 2 unspent warp charge points at the end of the turn. Okay, but I'm just not really too convinced just how powerful that is, really. Then there's Hideous Visage for +20 points for a 6-inch aura of -1 leadership and -1 combat attrition. Not too bad when stacked on Demonic Terror. That makes him really quite a big debuff piece there, and he's one that's likely to be able to just stomp up the board and go toe-to-toe with the enemy quite easily. Finally, there's Revoltingly Resilient, +30 points, and this gives you Great Unclean One -1 damage. I can't possibly think which of these is going to be the one that's going to be taken by just about everyone. Overall though, seems big, very, very tanky, and rather dangerous as well. Moving on to the other Nurgle units, first up we have the troops. Plague Bearers have gone up in points a lot to 15 points, though in exchange they've had some decent stat line buffs. They're toughness 5 and 2 wounds now, plus get the 4+ demon save at range. A lot harder to kill, even with Disgustingly Resilient gone, and plus they hit quite a lot harder in melee as well. 2 attacks with a Plague Sword that's now AP -2, and 6s auto wound the enemy. Still though, for the points cost, they don't look like they're all that dangerous in combat. They should do some chip damage, but they still seem to be more about the durability, and they do cost quite a bit at 150 points for a unit. Otherwise, the icons and the instruments are free for all of the lesser demons. They both grant the keywords, and together allow you to ignore combat attrition modifiers and +1 leadership, so they won't be running away too easily. And I would bear in mind that as well as losing Disgustingly Resilient, they also lost that Cloud of Flies rule for -1 to hit in big squads. You can only take units of 10 of them now, you can't take hordes, and the Plague Bearers no longer reroll wound rolls in melee, but I'd say between 6s auto wounding and AP -2, they are stronger. Still though, I do sort of feel like they're kind of annoying that you have to spend so many points to get them. I'm not convinced they're going to be very good for doing anything much besides camping objectives in a fairly durable way. Otherwise, the other Nurgle troops choice are the Nurglings. They haven't moved to any other point in the force organisation slot like some other armies did. They're only 20 points, so they dropped 5 points, but they have lost a fair bit of utility in that they don't have Obsec now, and you can't use them to fill compulsory detachment slots, so if you want to run a battalion of Nurgle, you're still going to want the Plague Bearers. Still though, they're really quite a cheap unit that actually is reasonably tough and can just be plonked forward on midfield objectives. I think they'll still certainly have a role in the Chaos Demons army. In terms of other things on their datasheet, they got +1 toughness to toughness 3, their demon save is a fairly meagre 6+5+1, and their leadership is only leadership 6 now. They no longer get their disgustingly resilient against damage 1 attacks, but they have gained a -1 to hit, so against a lot of targets that is going to be kind of similar. Their melee is 4 attacks at strength 2, 6s to hit auto wound, which seems to be a common theme across the Nurgle force. A unit or 2 seems to be pretty nice disruptive screening to me. Next up, we've got the slightly heavy hitters of the Nurgle force, Beast of Nurgle and Plague Drones. Beasts of Nurgle really have seen their role change quite a bit. They're up to 80 points all the way up from 35, so over doubled in cost, but they've got some really interesting rules. Their unit size is only 1 to 3 now, but they got some pretty massive stat line boosts. Their strength 6, toughness 6 as well, a huge 7 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 7, and a 5+4+ demon save. I think perhaps the most disconcerting thing about them, though, is their grotesque regeneration rule. If you damage a beast but don't kill it, it regenerates all its lost wounds at the end of the phase. It means unless your opponent hits them with a very, very powerful damage dealing unit, or unless they focus fire on them, there is at least a reasonable chance with those demon saves that you're just not going to quite do enough damage to kill one, and then all the damage is wasted. It'll make them just excellent units for skirmishing with enemy light units on objectives, where even if they chip away at them for multiple turns, they basically won't get anywhere. Otherwise, on their datasheet, their melee strength user AP -2 and 6s to hit cause 2 mortal wounds and the attack sequence ends. I'd still maybe say not super good damage outputs, but that will chip away at units quite nicely. Previously, they were only AP nothing, and that meant that they were kind of limited. Otherwise, they've got a heroic intervention at 6-inch range, a gooey demise where they explode on a 6 for 1 mortal wound on death. Their Slime Trail rule became that stratagem to prevent falling back, and unfortunately they aren't a core unit, so won't be getting rerolls from Heralds or Great Unclean Ones and things. Lastly, for the Nurgle battle line, we've got the Plague Drones, 45 points up from 35. The unit size is 3 to 6, and again they've got a fairly meaty stat line. They've gained strength, toughness, 1 wound, 1 attack, and a better save. So again, an all-around glow-up, despite losing disgustingly resilience. Again, very beefy and tough to take down. Toughness 6 with 5 wounds and a 4+ save against range isn't going to get shot down very easily at all. For damage output, they still have those death heads shooting attacks, D3 shots at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 1. They have the blast keyword, and then their melee is a standard plague sword as per the plague bearers, plus one of the 2 upgrades on the flies, either a proboscis or some talony bits. 2 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, or 4 attacks at strength 4, AP -2 and damage 1, both of those being malefic profiles. Finally, again like the plague bearers, they get their icons and instruments for free, and they are a core cavalry unit with fly and the plague bearer's keyword. It seems like if you want some actual Nurgle damage dealers that'd take buffs well, these guys would probably be the way to go. Otherwise for Nurgle, we've got a bunch of heralds and characters, plus their plague tree fortification. Rotigus is the unique Great Unclean one, 320 points, so plus 50 on before, and kind of similar stats to a standard Great Unclean one, but with an extra 2 wounds. Weapons wise, it's got a few alterations. The Vomit becomes a 12-inch Assault 2d6 attack at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 1, so he vomits on things very hard. He attacks with something called a Gnarl Rod, which is basically a bile sword with a flat damage 3 on the strike, but only AP -2 on the sweep, so a little bit weaker. And he does get a fun Fanged Maw attack to represent his belly taking a bite out of you. I'd say the main reason to take him though are a couple of other things. His Psychic is a bit better, as if he casts a power on a 7+, the nearest unit within 24 inches takes D3 mortal wounds. Should be worth at least a little bit of damage each Psychic phase. And he also has the Warp Locust keyword, so he's a nice Great Unclean one for deep striking in Nurgle dead close. Moving on to Heralds, and first we have the standard Poxbringer, 90 points up from 75, now strength 5, toughness 6 and 6 wounds, with a 5+4+ demon save. In general, the vast majority of the Heralds got fairly amped up stats, most of them seem to get tougher and a bit more dangerous in melee too. His combat is now up to strength 5, AP 3 and damage 2, with 6's auto wound, kind of like a relic blade sword, I guess. Heralds throughout the book give you reroll 1s to wounds for core units within 6 inches, and the Poxbringer himself also has the benefit of giving Plaguebearer core units a +1 damage whenever they make a wound roll of 6 in melee. He still casts a psychic power as well, so for 90 points for amped up combat stats, rerolls, a Plaguebearer buff and a psychic spell, it seems like quite a good collection of buffs. Otherwise, for the variant heralds, there's the Spoilpox Scrivener. This one's 100 points. It's got similar sort of stat line changes to the Poxbringer, plus a fun sneeze attack that basically attacks like a standard Flamer does at 6 inches. His melee is a standard Plaguebearer Plague Sword, plus a big strength 6 -1 damage 3 jaw attack, and his buffs are the standard Herald rerolls, a keep counting tally that gives you 1 Plaguebearer unit to get +1 to hits, and gains Obsec or counts as 2 models for it, and he no longer buffs movement. Seems fairly solid on the Plague Drones, I guess, seeing as getting Obsec is quite big for them as they're so tough. Epidemius is 90 points, so he's dropped 15 on before. His tally was really quite fun and used to work on cross-faction Nurgle demons, like the Death Guard demon engines say, but unfortunately that's no longer the case. His stat line's a little bit better, he's a bit tougher with 9 wounds and toughness 6, and the same melee as the Poxbringer but with 4 attacks. He does have the reroll ones rule for heralds now, but his tally has gone to be a Warpstorm point thing, meaning that you need to try and kill enemy units with the Nurgle models. For every model that dies, you add to your tally. If you get to 7 tally, then you generate a Warpstorm point at the end of the turn. In general, he just seems a little bit weak to me. I can't really see anyone wanting to take him instead of a standard Poxbringer, really. Next, we've got the Sloppity Bilepiper, the other variant Herald. 85 points now, so plus 20. His melee is still super weak, at strength 5 and damage 1 with 6's auto wounding. He grants the Herald rerolls, but has a couple of fun buffs. One of them allows either a Nurgle or Plaguebearer units to get a +1 to move, advance, and charge. Again, maybe could be okay on those Plague drones to give them more of a threat range. And in the morale phase, you get to select one enemy unit within 12 inches. If you roll 3d6 higher than their leadership, they lose Obsec and prevent actions. Seems pretty possible, particularly with the Demon's debuffs. He also has that fun stratagem to deal the mortal wounds as well. Lastly, for Nurgle special characters, we have Horticulous Slimux, an 140 point Snail Rider, 20 points cheaper than he was before. He's now toughness 7 with a 4+ save at range and melee, and attacks with Lopping Shears at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 2 with 6's auto wounding. Mulch the Snail gives you 2 extra attacks at strength 7, AP -4, damage 3. He has the Herald reroll to wounds, and again he's got a couple of fun buffs of his own. One unit of beasts or plague drones get to reroll charges and get +1 to hit in melee. I guess if you do want to buff beasts somehow, this will be the way to do so. And then he's got a Seed the Garden special rule, which means that if you can get him wholly within an area terrain feature, you can then kind of corrupt the terrain feature for the rest of the game. You make it difficult ground for enemy troops, and if they finish any sort of move that isn't a pile-in or consolidation, they take D3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 2+. I guess perhaps the biggest issue might be getting that big base wholly within the area terrain feature. That seems like it might genuinely limit it a bit. Overall though, he seems alright, a bit more dangerous than some Nurgle units. Again, I'm not necessarily sure it's going to outweigh the buffing utility of a Poxbringer though. Lastly for Nurgle, we've got the Feculent Gnarlmaw. This one's a 75 point tree fortification, down by 20 compared with before, and now rather than being battlefield terrain, it's an immobile unit that can be attacked. It's toughness 7, 9 wounds, and with a 4+3+ demon save, so very hard to gun down, and you can set it up anywhere that's greater than 9 inches away from enemy models or their deployment zone, so you can push it up forward. As for what it brings you, it gets you basically 4 different benefits. First up, it is a Warp Locust, so it means that you can be deep striking Nurgle dead close. If the enemy assaults it in melee, it can try and do mortal wounds. Roll a dice, and on a 2 to 5 you get 1 mortal wound, on a d3 you get 6. If any model dies from attacking it, then you get yourself 1 extra Warpstorm point. It also makes Nurgle a bit harder to kill as well. Non-monster Nurgle units within 6 inches get -1 to hit, and then it can double down on that with Plague Bearers. One core unit nearby the Gnarlmaw gets to either regenerate D3 Plague Bearers or 1 Plague Drone from the dead. If you can manage to resurrect 1 Plague Drone over the course of the game, then you've gone a long way to paying off the points already, never mind any Warp Locust type benefits you also get to do, or damage from the -1 to hit thing. As always, fortification rules can make it a bit clunky to deploy, but with Warp Locust and some other things, it does look like it could be interesting enough in a Nurgle heavy list. Overall, as an army, Nurgle's looking decently tough, though kind of similar to before, standout damage units just really aren't there all that much. I'm a little bit unsold on Plague Bearers at the moment. I feel like they'd be a lot stronger if you could take big hordes of them. I think limiting them to units of 10 really doesn't help for a durable but not all that dangerous combat unit. So we're leaving the plagues behind and going on to the wrathful units of Khorne. First up for the Book of Blood, we have the Khorne Warlord traits. Again, the heralds can only take the first 3, and you can only have 1 Warlord trait throughout the army. First up, Aspect of Death is a 6-inch aura of -1 leadership and combat attrition. Karanak gets that, and when you're stacking it with Demonic Terror, it is kind of usable. For Khorne units though, I feel like they're generally going to want to focus on damage. Next up, and I think that the one that's largely going to be taken all the time, is the 5+ Feel No Pain. Take this on a Bloodthirster for a Bloodthirster that's basically 50% harder to kill than it would be normally. I feel like most of the rest of them just aren't going to get you as much value as that. Next up, there's Devastating Blow. This one's Ignore Wound Roll rules. Skulltaker takes this one, so he would ignore things like Feel No Pain and damage caps. Again, I guess this one could be okay. I guess it kind of depends on how set you are on countering things like Abaddon or Catan. Glory in Battle is a small melee buff, +1 attack if you're within 3 inches of the enemy, 2 attacks if you're within 3 inches of 6 or more models, and 3 attacks if you're within 3 inches of 11 or more. kind of okay but not great. Immense Power gives you +1 to wound in melee. I think that one is a fair bit stronger, though I would bear in mind that with Bloodthirsters and things you might often be wounding on 2s anyway. And then finally we've got Rage Incarnate, +1 to advance and charge, and if Khorne units charge a unit that is in combat with your Warlord, they also get +1 to charge as well. Scarbrand gets that one as he is exceptionally angry, and a little bit of extra chance with delivering a unit into combat never hurts. Really though, out of these I'd probably just take Brazen Hide on a Bloodthirster, it seems like it is the best. Next up we've got the Khorne Relics. The Armour of Scorn is an upgrade to a monster unit. You get +1 to your save versus damage 1 attacks, and a 4+ save against mortal wounds. I think the +1 to save thing might not work rules as written at the moment due to demon saves not being modifiable. It's kind of clear what the intent is though. Both of those are okay durability increases. I guess you probably don't want it on the one with the 5+ feel no pain though, as that would sort of double dip on the mortal wound protection. Next there's the Crimson Crown. If you kill any models you retain up to 2 unspent Warpstorm points at the end of the turn. Again, not super exciting in my opinion. The Rune of Brass is an anti-psyker one. Psykers within 12 inches peril on any double and take d6 mortal wounds when they do. Really quite scary anti-psyker stuff, though I guess sometimes they might just be able to back off from your anti-psyker guy and still just cast anyway. The Blood Drinker Talisman is a relic that you use after fighting. For each model slain on a 5+ you regenerate a wound to a maximum of 6. Could be potentially interesting in combination with one of the Exalted Bloodthirster traits, the one that doesn't allow you to take more than 8 wounds in one phase. Still though, if the amount of healing is a bit situational, against armies without many models you're not going to get very much value out of that one. Angrath, King of Blades, gives you +1 damage and ignores modifiers to hit and wound. A pretty solid combat upgrade that one. I think on paper that one looks really quite interesting on a Bloodthirster's Great Cleaver. I believe that this would allow you to get the +1 damage even on their sweep attack, so you could have a Bloodthirster with 16 strength 8 damage 3 attacks, which sounds like it's a nasty way to make a mess of most things. Finally we've got Skull Reaver. This one's an Axe of Khorne for Bloodthirsters, so the smaller axe, not the bigger axe. It's basically got the same sort of profile as the smaller axe, but you basically get the Great Axe profile if you're attacking vehicles or monsters. Strength ×2 and damage d3 +3. The reason that you want to take this is that it gets you the attacks when you need them most, and also still allows you to take one of those nasty flails. Out of these, I feel like maybe the King of Blades plus that Skull Reaver one might be some of the most interesting. The Anti-Psyker one isn't terrible though, nor is the Blood Drinker Talisman. For the stratagems of the Blood God, Khorne has 6, for some reason less than the other deities, and I'm not sure why. Seems a bit on the mean side, particularly as they don't get psychic powers. First up there's Frenetic Bloodlust, 1 or 2 CP. Use this on a core Bloodletter unit at the start of the fight phase. Either if they're not engaged they can make a 6-inch normal move closer to the enemy for 2 CP, or pile in early for 1 CP. Both are potentially worth it for playing games with combats, or maybe getting to objectives. The pile-in one could maybe be used to bait an enemy to stop them gaining movement, for example. Handy enough to have, occasionally it would come in useful. Next for 2 CP there's Glorious Decapitation. This one's a rather fun character when one of your Khorne characters kills an enemy character, and for the rest of the game they gain a 6-inch aura of all Khorne units wounding on 6s, causing an extra mortal wound on the enemy. This one applies just to anything core, so it would give you a small damage increase. I guess it's going to be most meaningful on things with more attacks, maybe 10-man units of Bloodletters. It is kind of fun. Maybe if you could trigger it on something that's likely to be getting stuck in for the rest of the game, then it could be worth the command points. For 1 CP, there's Relics of the Brass Citadel, extra relics, again no Warlord traits. For 1 CP, there's Contempt for Sorcery, a 4+2 auto-denier power within 24 inches, and it gets improved to a 3+ if you're less than 12 inches from Fleshhounds. This one is a really nice one to have, definitely messes with the Psyker's plans. For 1 CP, there's Brass Stampede, mortal wound impact hits with cavalry or vehicles. 6s cause d3 mortal wounds and you get 1 dice per cavalry model, or if you use it with a vehicle then it's 3 to 5 cause d3 and at 6s cause d3 +3. Doesn't seem super strong with the amount of damage that you get, perhaps best used on something like a Blood Throne. Finally for 1 CP there's Banner of Blood. This is an icon unit, so it's going to be the Bloodletters or the Blood Crushers. You use this when you're charging and you get +1 d6 and discard the lowest result. Usually that'll mean that you'll be averaging somewhere between an 8 and 9 inch charge, Really quite nice if you've got a long one to make. Failing charges is not going to make Khorne pleased. I must admit, for Khorne, the stratagem offerings are pretty slim pickings. Out of these ones, I think the content for sorcery is really good, but of course only against Psychers, and Banner of Blood is pretty handy for the Bloodletters and the Blood Crushers. But otherwise, I must admit the rest do seem to be at least kind of situational. Finally, we get on to the units of Khorne, and we'll start out with the Bloodthirsters themselves. 310 points for all loadouts now. You don't have any separate datasheets. Previously they were around about 240 points give or take. Again, they've got a bunch of stat line buffs, an extra 4 wounds, an extra pip of strength, toughness, and 2 attacks. They don't have a 3+ armor save anymore, but they do get a 4+ demon save at range and in melee. Going up to 20 wounds is a bit of a mixed blessing, as they won't be able to hide behind terrain anymore. Obscuring terrain doesn't mean anything when they've got that wounds characteristic, so they will directly be targeted, even if they're a lot tougher to kill at toughness 8 and with that 4+. Damage wise, they all gained a Hellfire Breath attack, a 12-inch Assault D6 attack at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 1, a nice little flamer to barbecue some infantry, and then you've got the option of either a Great Axe of Khorne or taking a regular Axe of Khorne with either the Flail or the Lash. I'd say the Great Axe of Khorne is perhaps the really exciting one. Its attack is a strength ×2, AP 4 and damage D3 plus 3. Pretty massive when you've got 8 attacks hitting on 2s, or you have the option of double the attacks at strength 8, AP -3 and damage 2. That's going to ruin Space Marines' days with 16 attacks there. Otherwise, you can downgrade to the Axe of Khorne, which is only strength 12, AP 4 and damage D6, or the double attack profile is at damage 1. If you do choose to do that though, then you get an extra shooting attack, either the Lash of Khorne at Assault 8, Strength User, AP -1 and Damage 2, so kind of like a boosted autocannon profile, or you get something fun called a Blood Flail, a 12-inch Assault 1 attack at Strength ×2, AP 4 and Damage 3d3, but the extra damage isn't lost, so if you punch the wound through, you could be killing something like 6 1-wound infantry. I feel like that would be super satisfying to use whenever you attack with it, but you are giving up a lot of damage on the Great Axe. In terms of special rules, they get the reroll ones to hit aura for Khorne, Relentless Carnage, a 2+ chance to deal D3 mortal wounds after they've fought, and again you've got the choice of 3 different exalted traits, either Indomitable Onslaught for 40 points, which means that you can't lose more than 8 wounds in one phase, Master of Blood for 20 points, which is +1 to your strength and attacks in the first round of combat, simple and effective, but not super strong, and finally Rage Unchained for 35 points, doubling the number of wounds for their degrading profile, which I don't think is quite as exciting. I'd say probably that both the first two seem kind of usable. I think they're maybe just a little bit take or leave though for their points cost. You could just field them without. Otherwise, combine them with a 5+ Feel No Pain seems quite good. I did make an entire video on Bloodthirsters if you want to check that one out, going through a few of their options. Moving on into the other Khorne units, and the iconic Bloodletters are 130 points now. You have to get them in a squad of 10 like the rest, and again it's a pretty big increase going up from 80 points for the squad. Again though, like most demons in the book, they've seen profile bumps, their strength 5 base, toughness 4 and 2 attacks, and they've also got a 4+ demon save at range. I'd say the most exciting thing about them is their melee, strength 5 AP 3 and damage 2 Hellblades, not feeling perhaps too far behind things like maybe Sisters of Battle Repentia for the cost. From the heralds and things, they've also got access to a bunch of fun buffs, and can be deployed quite easily into combat via the various deep strike mechanics. I feel like they're perhaps one of the most interesting units out of Khorne, mainly just from alpha striking things out of deep strike, and then just crippling them with a whole bunch of scary attacks. Blood Crushers are 45 points, up from 40. They've got a 10-inch move, strength and toughness 5, 4 wounds, 3 attacks, and a 4+ save at range and in melee. They are a lot more dangerous, as the Hellblades got damage too, but also they're really quite tanky now with the extra toughness and the save. As well as the Rider's attacks, with the 3 attacks with the Hellblade, you also get some attacks with the Steed as well. 4 of those Malefic attacks at Strength User, AP -2 and damage 1, and +2 strength if you charge, so strength 7 there. They are core cavalry with the Bloodletter keyword, so they're another interesting option for buffing with heralds. Otherwise, for Khorne's battle line, there's also the Fleshhounds, 19 points, up from 16. They're a fast attack choice, and again I've got a ton of profile boosts. They move 12 inches, hit on 3s, a strength 5, toughness 4, 2 wounds, 3 attacks, and again a 4+ save against range. At range, they still have that burning roar from the Gorehound, the leader of the unit. That's basically a 12-inch flamer with AP -1. And the Fangs do look like they're a pretty general damage melee profile. 3 attacks at strength 5, AP -2 and damage 1, going up to damage 2 on the charge or if they make a heroic intervention. Finally, as they go after Psykers, they can also deny psychic power as well, plus they allow you to use that denial stratagem just that little bit more reliably. Kind of interesting, as I feel that both them and the Blood Crushers might be competing a little bit for the same role. Maybe Fleshhounds are a bit more outriding fast-moving units to harass enemy units and take objectives, where the Blood Crushers might be a bit more worthy of doing some big buffs with heralds and things. In the heavy support section, we've got the Skull Cannon, 100 points up from 90. It got a little bit faster at 8-inch movement, gained an extra 2 wounds to 9, and has +1 strength to 6. It gets a 4+ save at range and melee, so is at least fairly durable, and its main gun is a 48-inch shot, heavy D3+3, strength 8, AP -2, and damage 2 with the blast keyword. It ignores cover as well, which is quite nice for digging out things with Armour of Contempt. In melee, it only gets the 2 fairly underwhelming attacks at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 2, but gets Malefic 4 attacks with the attendant Hellblades as strength user, AP 3, damage 2 there. It's got the vehicle keyword, it's not core, but overall it seems alright to be honest, a fairly generalist damage profile and the longest range in the book. Finally, before we get into Khorne characters, we've also got the Skull Altar, a new datasheet for the book that was previously in the Vigilus one. It was 110 points before and now it's a mere 50, but it still doesn't seem like it'd do an absolute whole lot. Defenses wise, it's a 9 wound building with a 4+4+ save. It does have the Warp Locus ability. It does have the Warp Locus keyword if your opponents approach it, but you can't set it up the board like the Feculent Narmor, so that maybe is a little bit less valuable. Otherwise though, it does do a few helpful things to help out your own deployment zone. It gives you a +2 to cast within 18 inches for enemies. You get to embark 1 Herald on it, and it allows them to use their command phase and aura abilities. And I guess they go just a little bit further because it's got quite a big profile. While there, the Herald can also do a fun action to try and farm some Warpstorm points. You get an extra Warpstorm point if there's any Khorne units in melee within 12 inches of the thing, though I guess that would kind of imply that your opponent has moved units across to fight the Khorne demons in combat, which doesn't sound like the best idea. I guess it is demonic, so you could deep strike it if you wanted, if you had space for it. And I guess it is very cheap if you just wanted something with the Warp Locus rule. Seems a bit passable though, and certainly the fortification rules don't help it out too much with the 9th edition terrain at the moment. Moving on, let's take a look at the other champions of Khorne who are going to be taking skulls for the Blood God. Foremost amongst them we have the character Bloodthirster Scarbrand, who's 320 points up from 310. He has kind of similar stats to the standard Bloodthirster, again like the other character versions, +2 wounds, and interestingly his attacks degrade upwards to 10 at his lowest bracket. Of course he's the ground bound one, so he doesn't have the wings, he only moves 8 and doesn't have fly, which is a bit of a disadvantage. Weapons wise, he swaps his Flamer attack for a Bellow of Fury, a 12-inch attack at Assault 2d6, Strength 5, AP -1, Damage 1. A solid upgrade even if it's a bit less AP. And his paired axes, Slaughter and Carnage, give him basically the same stats as the Great Axe on the main attack, but he also ignores invuls as well. Kind of interesting that he's a model that ignores invuls, but his own saves would not be ignored by that same attack. The sweep mode again is double the attacks, but only AP -2 damage rather than AP 3. And then he's got a few other special rules of his own. He can't be affected by psychic powers, and he rerolls that reroll ones to hit aura with an interesting bloodthirsty melee aura that affects both players. When both units, friends and foe, are within 6 inches of him, he gives them +1 attack, also pass morale, and if they ever want to fall back, they need to roll 3d6 versus their leadership. If it's greater, then they just can't. In general, I guess that's usually going to help out the demons of Khorne more. They do really like being in melee after all. Finally, like the other character greater demons, he has the Warp Locus keyword, so you could deep strike Bloodletters dead close to him. Overall, seems decently scary, maybe the biggest disadvantage being the speed and being a big monster that can't get around terrain too well. Next up, for the generic Herald, we have the Bloodmaster, 90 points and up from 60. He's Strength 6, Toughness 5, 4 wounds and 5 attacks, and he gets a 4+ save at range and melee. Fairly beefy stats to be honest, for basically a big Bloodletter. In melee, his combat's got better as well. The Blade of Blood is now Strength user, AP 3 and Damage 3, and at strength 6 it means he's pretty awesome at taking down enemy characters. Finally, for his buff, he gets the Herald reroll wound rolls, and also gains a command phase buff for core bloodletter units for 6s to hit auto wounding. Seems solid enough, quite a nice melee stat line, coupled with 2 helpful buffs for bloodletters. The Skullmaster is the equivalent of the Bloodmaster on a Juggernaut, 130 points up from 95, and for the most part has very similar damage and a stat line. The main difference is that he moves 10 inches, he goes up to toughness 6-7 wounds, again with the 4+. His melee is the same as the Bloodmaster, the main difference is the bladed horn of the Juggernaut, and that makes those 4 malefic attacks at strength 6, AP -1, damage 2, +2 strength on the charge. It's extra speed, damage, and durability, but I'm not sure whether or not it'd really trade off to be okay at 40 points. Moving on, for the last generic herald, we have the Remmaster on a Blood Throne. This is the new name for the just standard Blood Throne datasheet, and it's gone up to 140 points from 115. This thing kind of weirdly only had movement 6 before, so it's gone up to movement 8 at least. It's toughness 7, 9 wounds, so it's a bit harder to kill. The Remmaster has 5 attacks, and it's got a 4+ save as well. In combat, he gets those standard Blade of Blood attacks, plus 4 Malefic Hellblade attacks from the Attendants, all made at strength 6. Otherwise, again, he functions fairly similar to the previous heralds. His command ability can go a little bit further, out to 9 inches, and he also has the inbuilt special rule where he personally rerolls wounds versus characters and monsters. I feel like if you were going for the cavalry version, I'd be a bit more tempted to take this guy. He's even tougher than the Juggernaut and gets better secondary attacks, plus that nice reroll ability. Next up, we've got Skulltaker, 110 points up from 90. He's basically a special character version of the standard Bloodmaster. His beefy stats give him toughness 6, 5 wounds, 6 attacks, and again a 4+ save. His melee weapon is a Blade of Blood striking at strength 6 again, and it ignores invuls. Those base stats are pretty excellent for taking down characters in their own right, but he also gets to re-roll hit and wound rolls against them, so killing things like Space Marine captains would almost be laughably easy. Finally, for buffs, again he has the Herald reroll 1s to wound aura, but he also makes 1 core bloodletter unit get +1 to hit in the command phase. Again, a very solid combat buff. Finally, for the forces of the Blood God, we have the Fleshhound Karanak, 100 points up from 75. He moves a bit faster like the Fleshhounds do, is strength 6, toughness 5, 5 wounds at base, with 6 attacks and a 5+4+ save. In general, he's a fair bit more dangerous, though he does have 1 wound less than he had previously. In combat, his jaws are strength 6, AP 2, damage 2. You get to pick 1 character at the very start of the game, and if you manage to wound them later in the game, then his attacks get converted to mortal wounds if you wound them. Kind of symbolises him going after his prey. He's really quite nice for stopping psychic powers as well. You can deny 2 powers with him as if he were a psyker. And he also has that Fleshhound keyword, again giving you the option for that boosted stratagem to turn off a power. Otherwise, he buffs Fleshhounds as well. He gives them reroll 1s to wound, and again, really not liking psychic, he can make them reroll all wound rolls versus psykers themselves. Seems fun. His melee certainly isn't quite as good as some of the other characters here, but I guess he's quite a lot faster and comes with quite a lot of Deny the Witch. Overall for Khorne, I think that things are looking at least a little bit more positive than they were in the previous Codex. From first look, I think that just standard bloodletters look very interesting at 13 points per model for those 2 damage 2 attacks. They seem like one of the best units that you could jump out of Warp Locus or Boosted Deep Strike and just absolutely go to town on one of the enemy units. Bloodthirsters actually seem pretty solid from a first glance, and I think for 100 points the Skull Cannons seem okay as well. They seem like a pretty cheap way of adding quite a lot of shooting and still fight a little bit in combat too. Next up though, let's move on to the forces of the Dark Prince, and we'll start out with the Slaanesh Warlord traits. Again, Heralds can take the first 3, and the first one is Warp Mists, allowing you to retain 2 unspent Warpstorm points if the bearer is on the board. It seems that they wanted every single god to have this ability, though it doesn't seem super strong to me. Next up, we've got Fatal Caress. Melee attacks ignore invuls on a 5+. Seems pretty nice on a Keeper of Secrets, would help them get to grips with hard targets. Then there's the Murder Dance, plus D3 attacks on the charge. The Mask gets that one, and again seems solid on a Keeper, perhaps a bit more general purpose that helps you out against most things. Quicksilver Duelist allows you to reroll all hits in melee, and against characters you get to reroll wound rolls as well. Shalaxi gets that one, and it seems just a touch more niche to me. Savage Hedonist is the start of each battle round. You get to add +1 to your strength to a maximum of 3, so I guess you're going round with strength +3 from turn 3 onwards. I guess that one might be a bit more meaningful on the heralds and things if you weren't taking a keeper. Finally, there's the Aura of Bewitchment. This one gives you an aura of enemy units within 6 inches can't do actions. Celeste gets that one, and I'm not quite as much of a fan of that. Sometimes it's going to be relevant, though I guess there'd be plenty of games where it's just not going to be whatsoever. Out of those two, I'd guess that Fatal Caress and the Murder Dance are perhaps going to be taken the most. Both of those seem pretty solid damage boosts. Moving on to the relics for She Who Thirsts. First up, we've got the Forbidden Gem. Previously, this was a very powerful one that stopped a character fighting for a phase. Now it has changed a fair bit. One unit within 12 inches loses their aura abilities, and you get to apply that in the command phase each turn rather than once per game. Happening in the command phase I don't think is super strong though. It does mean that you'd have to have your units in position even before this goes off. I guess it's not impossible if you've got a keeper rushing forwards, but I guess if your opponent really needs to avoid it, it might not be impossible. Next there's the Mark of Excess, +1 attack and 1 extra further attack for killing characters, monsters or vehicles. I'd say that's not super standout as it kind of depends on what you're fighting. Next there's Soul Stealer. This one's a Relic Wit Stealer sword or Hellforged sword for a Demon Prince. It becomes Strength +2, AP 3, Damage 3. It allows you to regenerate 1 wound per model slain to a maximum of 6 per phase, and every 6 versus an Eldari model auto wounds, presumably as it's hungry for their souls. That actually seems like it could regenerate you a fair amount of wounds over the course of a game. Maybe seems particularly tempting on a Demon Prince, as that one would also get you an extra pip of strength. The Slothful Claws can either be used on Ravaging Claws on the Heralds or Snapping Claws on the Keepers. They become +1 damage, and if they cause wounds, then the unit can't be affected by auras until the end of the phase. I guess if you strike against a melee unit, then I guess you get to turn off their damage buff auras for when they hit you back. Seems okay, though not enormously exciting perhaps. Silver Strike is a Relic Wit Stealer sword that becomes Strength +3, AP 3 and Damage 3. It grants -1 to hit and to wound for anything injured but not killed by it. I think the standard one just gives you -1 to wound. I guess that is really quite a powerful debuff effect. If you can get it to come into play, then that seems really quite solid. I guess at least a fair amount of time though, you might well just kill whatever you charge. Finally there's the Whip of Agony, which replaces a Keeper's Living Whip or the Herald's Lashes of Torment. It becomes Assault 8, so an extra 2 attacks, plus the attacks versus non-vehicles or auto wound on a 4+ to hit. That honestly seems like quite a good damage boost to be honest, particularly for the Living Whip. 8 strength 6 and damage 2 attacks actually looks like it to be pretty nasty with that ability. Overall, I'd say that most of these are usable but not super standout. I'd say perhaps my favourite might be that Soul Stealer one. Regenerating 1 wound per slain model actually could add up to a fair bit, plus extra strength on a Demon Prince doesn't hurt. Slaanesh Psychic next, and here we have the Soulstain Discipline. Some of these really do seem very strong. First up, we've got Cacophonic Choir, which is a Warp Charge 7 18-inch spell. You roll 3d6 versus an enemy's leadership, and they take 1 mortal wound per point exceeding it to a maximum of 6. That one's going to be quite swingy, but if it goes off, it's actually genuinely quite scary. You'll be able to get quite a lot of enemies to -1 leadership at least with the fast-moving Slaanesh units and Demonic Terror, never mind some of the other debuffs. If you roll it against an enemy unit that's leadership 7, that's going to average you 3 or 4 mortal wounds, and you do have a pretty reasonable chance of just rolling a bit lucky and getting a big 6. Obviously a bit less useful against things like Custodies though. Next we've got Symphony of Pain, Warp Charge 7 and 18 inches. Again you target 1 enemy unit and they're -1 to hit and wound in melee. Really quite a nasty debuff there, though it does depend on your opponent having a good melee unit to use it on. Hysterical Frenzy was previously a fight again in the Psychic phase ability. Now again it's a Warp Charge 7 18-inch range power. You target a Slaanesh core unit and they get +1 attack and melee 6s cause 1 extra hit. On Demonettes that's a fairly staggering damage output buff. They don't have bad damage in the first place, and that adds over 50% to their extra expected amount of hits landed. If you've got a Slaanesh Herald with Psychic aiming to buff the Demonettes, then that one seems excellent. Next there's Delightful Agonies, Warp Charge 6 and 18-inch range, a 5+ Feel No Pain for 1 Slaanesh core unit. The Feel No Pain has got a bit better, but you can't use this on Keepers of Secrets anymore sadly, it has to be core. I guess it's okay on Demonettes, might be kind of interesting on things like Fiends though, as they're core as well. Next there's Purveyne of Slaanesh, Warp Charge 6 and 18-inch range. You roll 1d6 per model in the enemy unit, and each 5+ causes 1 mortal wound up to a maximum of 6. Games Workshop don't seem to be too shy about giving you some really quite powerful damage dealers in this codex. That one would average you around 3 or 4 mortal wounds if you got it targeted against a 10 model unit. I guess it is a bit unreliable in that if you're fighting knights or something, it won't be good. Finally, there's Phantasmagoria, warp charge 7 and 18-inch range. You roll 6d6, and for each 5 plus the enemy unit takes a mortal wound, and until the next psychic phase, they're also an extra -1 leadership per mortal wound taken. Seems like that one could be a really easy one to combo with Cacophonic Choir, reduce their leadership, and hit them with the second one to maybe swing for the big 6 mortal wounds. Seems pretty scary all in all. Overall, I think that the discipline is genuinely quite scary. The Choir and Phantasmagoria seem like a good mortal wound combo. Hysterical Frenzy is excellent for buffing demonettes. 5 plus Feel No Pains are generally a good thing to have, and the debuff one is pretty potent as well. Next up we get to the stratagems, and for Slaanesh there's 8 of them. For 1 CP there's Thirst for Souls, reroll hits and wounds versus Eldari in melee. That's going to be a big damage dealer if you're fighting any of the Eldar. For 1 CP there's Razor Sharp Caress. Demonettes get an extra AP -1 better on 6s to wound. I guess if you desperately need to deal some damage to a very tough unit, maybe if they were wounding on 5s anyway, then that could actually be a meaningful increase. For 1 CP there's the Endless Dance. A demonette unit fighting gets to pile in and consolidate an extra 3 inches. If that one makes the difference between reaching an objective or tagging an enemy unit, then it's going to be well worth the CP. For 1 CP, there's Impossible Elegance. A Slaanesh character can't be hit on a 1 to 3 in melee, and you can't use that on vehicles. That's a genuinely good defensive debuff if you're fighting something that hits on 2s, like a character or the Adeptus Custodes. Seems a good way of making a Keeper of Secrets take a bit less damage, but they do already have a -1 to hit built in. There's the standard one for extra relics, then a 1 CP one for Melodic Delirium. A Fiend's unit gets an aura of -2 to cast for psychic powers in the enemy's psychic phase. I guess that will be very disruptive if you're in the heart of a Grey Knight or Thousand Suns army. Sorry I didn't write it here, but the aura is a 12-inch range, so if you've just had some fiends that have just charged something, it could cover a fair chunk of the board. For 1 CP, there's Race Through the Warp. A vehicle unit gets to return to strategic reserve. Could be a way to get a chariot around and behind the enemy for the last few turns. And finally there's for 1 CP Rapturous Standard. An Icon unit gets to reroll all hits. That's a really massive demonette benefit, and that would combine very nicely and easily with Hysterical Frenzy for massively more damage than you'd expect them to do. Overall, I'd say compared with the previous 2 sets of stratagems, that's quite a good set. Rerolling hits for demonettes seems great. Impossible Elegance could save a bit of damage on a keeper. And the Fiend's Psychic debuff one and the extra Consolidate and Pile In both could be really powerful in the right situation. Moving on, let's take a look at the Slaanesh units and start out with the biggest and scariest of them, the Keeper of Secrets. 280 points now, so plus 50 points on what they were before. Again, it seems that no war gear costs points for them. Stat line wise, they've seen a few buffs. They move a massive 16 inches now, which is pretty crazy, though they will miss that Locus of Grace giving them advance and charge, which Slaanesh no longer has. In general, that's been swapped for just longer movement distances. Otherwise, they hit on 2s, a Strength 6, Toughness 7, 20 wounds, 6 attacks, Leadership 10, and a 5 plus 4 plus Demon save. Again, going up to 20 wounds is a mixed blessing, but it does mean that they're tougher overall with the 4 plus save and that. War gear wise, they're armed with a Wit Stealer sword, Strength plus 2, AP 3, and Damage 3, and if you damage an enemy, then they get -1 to wound in melee for the rest of the game. All the keepers carry this, as well as their Snapping Claws. They've become a Malefic 4 weapon that hits at Strength user, AP -4 and Damage 3. Previously the Snapping Claw attacks degraded as the keeper took damage, now that's no longer the case. Then in the other hand you've got the choice between 4 different bits of war gear. First up the Living Whip for 6 attacks at Strength 6, AP -2, Damage 2. The range has been buffed on that one to go out to 12. The Shining Aegis gives you a 4 plus save both at range and in melee. The Sinister's Hand allows you to regenerate D3 wounds if you slay any models in melee, and the Ritual Knife allows you to get one model that was damaged but not killed to take an extra D3 mortal wounds on a 2+. All of those are theoretically helpful and usable. I think probably my favourite out of those is the Living Whip, though the Shining Aegis might be good as well, as a 4 plus invul and melee is pretty awesome. For special rules, they get the reroll ones to hit aura for Slaanesh core units. They no longer reroll their own wound rolls, I'm afraid. Their mesmerizing form now gives them a -1 to hit both at range and in melee. Previously I think it was just melee. and they cast 2 psychic powers and deny 1. Finally, for their other upgrade option, there's the option for Exalted Keepers of Secrets, and there's 3 upgrades. 35 points for Diaphanous Panoply, which is -1 to wound at range. That's really quite good insurance against getting the Keeper shot to death, particularly as they're also -1 to hit. Epicurean of Agonies for 25 points means that 6s in melee do an extra hit. A nice uncomplicated damage buff there. An Insatiable Onslaught for 20 points gives you +2 to advance and charge, increasing their threat range even further. Looks like you'd have an average threat range of 25 inches with that before you've even thought about CP rerolls. I honestly think that you could probably justify 3 keepers, one with each one of those traits. They all seem very usable and worth it for the points. Perhaps that -1 to wound is a particularly good survivability increase for the cost. Looks good though, I'm sure we'll still get plenty of people running them en masse. Moving on, let's talk through the other Slaanesh units. First up, we've got Demonettes for 120 points for 10. Again, like the other lesser demons, you can only take them in squad sizes of 10 once more, and if you wanted 10 of them before, that would mean it's increased by 50 points. They are the cheapest of the 4 flavours of lesser demons though, and for that cost, their stat line really seems good to me. They've got a big 10-inch movement, which is nice on Auspex units. They're strength 4 and get 4 attacks now, made at AP -2 and damage 1. And they also gains that 4+ demon save against range, so potentially they'll be a bit harder to stop getting into combat, though I think for the points increase that kind of balances out with the extra points. They get the free mark and icon, so hopefully shouldn't take too many things from morale, plus it allows that really good icon stratagem. And that Graceful Killer's extra attack in big units is gone. Obviously you can't take big units anymore. Out of the 4 flavours of lesser demons, I feel like Demonettes might still be arguably the best. Very fast moving Obsec with a flurry of fairly general purpose attacks, and access to some absolutely great buffs very easily. Otherwise, we've got Fiends for 35 points, down from 40. Their stat line is fairly similar to what it was before, gained 1 pip of strength and the demon save of 4+ against range, but otherwise they're very fast moving and get 4 attacks. Their combat is strength user, AP -2 and damage 2, so again solid and general purpose at strength 5, plus they get an extra malefic tail attack at strength 5, AP 3 and damage 3. Their Musk ability now makes enemy units -1 to hit in combat, and they're no longer the source of preventing enemy fallback anymore. Finally, they are a core unit, so they can get Herald rerolls, and they can be targeted by that 5+ Feel No Pain type spell, which seems like it could be extra good on them. Really not bad buffs at all, considering that they also got a points cut. They seem like they could be pretty fast and threatening fast movers for the cost. Finally, we've got 20 point Seekers. They're up from 16 points, and they've got kind of similar buffs to Demonettes, but are toughness 4, 2 wounds, and have the crazy long move of 16 inches on their steeds of Slaanesh. Besides the standard 4 Demonette attacks at strength 4, AP -2, their steeds also get their tongue attacks, Malefic 2 at strength 4, damage 1. They don't get any AP on those though. Basically Demonettes, but faster, tougher, and a little bit more anti-infantry, and they also get a +1 to charge as well. I'm still not super convinced that they're going to be that worth it. They don't really seem to do a lot that standard Demonettes don't do. Plus they don't have Obsec, don't fill troop slots, and while they're very fast, it's not like Demonettes aren't speedy already. Moving on, we have the Chariots, 3 flavours of them, the Seeker and the Hellflayer now in the fast attack. The Seeker I believe was heavy support before, and then the Exalted Seeker Chariot does remain heavy support. The standard cheap Seeker Chariot is 65 points, up from 60. It has got a general stat line buff, 14-inch movement, hitting on 3s, strength 4, toughness 5, 7 wounds, 8 attacks, leadership 9, and a 4+4+ save. That's faster, more attacks, more wounds, and a better save there. In general, they're really quite anti-infantry focused, don't do that much against heavy hitters. The Lash of Torment is now an Assault 6 weapon at strength 4, AP -1, damage 1, so a few more shots and a bit more AP. Its melee is all strength user, AP -2 and damage 1, plus you get 4 Malefic Steed tongue attacks, so it basically seems to be a different flavour of more Demonette attacks to be honest. The thing gains an extra 2 attacks on the charge, plus you roll 4d6 when you make a successful charge, each 5+ is a mortal wound. Otherwise it's gained an inbuilt -1 to hit versus ranged attacks. It does have the vehicle keyword now, and it is not core. Overall it seems at least fairly tough for the cost with those decent saves. It doesn't seem to be a massive amount of damage though, it'll just generate a whole bunch of strength 4 damage 1 hits for clearing infantry. Moving on we have the Hellflayer, 75 points down from 80, a very similar profile to the Seeker Chariots. and this one also picks up the -1 to hit at range and gets the same sort of melee attacks. On top of the above profile though, the extra 10 points gets you Blades. They're a malefic attack at strength +2, so strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2, and they go all the way up to malefic 6 on the charge, though they don't get the mortal wound thing above. For 10 points extra, I feel like the Hellflare just looks flat better really. Only 10 points for 6 attacks at AP -2 and damage 2 is so easily worth it. Certainly outcompetes the regular one in my book. Otherwise, the third and bigger and beefier option is the Exalted Seeker Chariot, 85 points up from 80, and this one's basically very similar to the Seeker Chariot, though it has a couple of buffs, 12 wounds on its base profile and weapon skill 2+, and gets 8 attacks with the Steed's Tongues. The main advantage of this one is that it seems very tough for the cost. Despite the extra damage output increases, the extra points cost just doesn't really seem to make up for it that much. And I will bear in mind that this one degrades as well when the others don't. An extra 5 wounds worth of tough model seems okay for the extra 20 points though. I think I'd be most tempted by the Hellflares or the Exalted Seeker Chariots. Moving on to the other HQ choices, first up we have Shalaxi Hellbane, the Character Keeper of Secrets for an extra 20 points over the standard, up from 240 points in the previous Codex. Like the rest of the character ones, she gets an extra 2 wounds and the Warp Locust keyword, and she gets to take either that Living Whip or the Shining Aegis, and combines that with a sword called Soul Piercer, strength ×2, AP -4 and damage 3, though it does D3+3 to characters, which is pretty nice. It doesn't have the debuff effect of the Witstealer sword, but to be honest I'd much rather have this. Shalaxi has the same -1 to hit versus range and melee, and also gets a -1 to wound in melee as well. And she also gets the extra rule where she can heroic intervene 6 inches against enemy characters. I guess perhaps the biggest disadvantage is not being able to take warlord traits and relics, but to be honest I think for just 20 points over the standard keeper, she seems very worth it indeed. Tougher and better melee, Warp Locust to deliver more Slaanesh demons to the fight, extra damage versus characters is big, as is the -1 to wound in melee. I feel like she's going to get played quite a bit. The Infernal Enrapturous is 80 points up from 75. This Harp Lady and her Poor Bloke have got a fairly good stat line improvement. They move 9 inches, weapon skill 2+, strength and toughness 4, 4 wounds and 4 attacks, and a 4+ save at range. They have lost a pip of ballistic skill though, so the ranged attacks don't hit quite as well as before, though they have got better. Interestingly, the Infernal Enrapturous also has the Warp Locust keyword, so it's a really nice way to deliver Slaanesh demons to the fight. And besides that, she does quite a lot of other good stuff as well. The Harp does 6 shots at 18 inches, strength 5, AP -1, damage 1, or a big shot at 24 for strength 9, AP 3 and damage D3+3, which isn't bad at all on a character that you can screen. In melee she gets the Ravaging Claws for AP -2 and damage 2, gets Herald rerolls of 1 to wound, makes Psyker's Peril on any double within 24 inches, and as if that weren't enough, gets to resurrect 1 Dem model from a core unit within 6 inches, or D3 Demonette Infantry. She doesn't do any psychic, but still that's a hideous amount of abilities just for an 80-point model. Feels like we really can't go too far wrong with that. Warp Locust, OK damage, rerolls, psychic defense, and resurrecting models seems like it's a crazy amount of combos. Next up, a couple of other special characters. We've got the Mask at 90 points, up from 85. She's got a little bit tougher, is a bit faster, and has got more attacks. And she also gets a 4+ save both at range and in melee. Her attacks land at strength 4, AP 3, and damage 2. She gets the Herald rerolls, and has a debuff rule called the Eternal Dance, either making one enemy unit +1 to be hit in combat, or giving them -1 to hit or -1 to wound. Otherwise she can fall back and charge, and move through enemy models and terrain. Maybe not terrible, but perhaps just doesn't seem super stand out compared with the other heralds. Celesk is 200 points, down from 230. This is the Demon Prince with a herald on top of him. I must admit their melee stat line was pretty ridiculous before. If anything, they have got a little bit worse, but still seem very good for the 200 points. They hit on 2s with 6 attacks in melee at strength 7, AP -3, damage 3, and then the Herald also chases that down with an extra 6 strength 4 attacks at AP -2, damage 1. They've also got a Scourging Whip at 9-inch range, assault 6, strength 4, AP -2, damage 1 as well, so a bit more anti-infantry there. And then the pair gives out quite a lot of buffs as well. Reroll 1s to hit and to wound for core units, and casts 2 powers and denies 1. Not really all that tough for the cost, I suppose. but they do have a very scary amount of melee and very good rules for buffing nearby Demonettes or Slaanesh core units to cast and all those rerolls. Next up, we've got the Contorted Epitome, 160 points, down from 210. A really rather massive points cut there. For that premium, the stat line's basically unchanged. It moves 12 inches and has 8 wounds at toughness 5, 4+ saves both at range and in melee, and the cavalry keyword. Its combat has got a fair bit better. You get 8 attacks at strength 4, AP 2, damage 2, plus Malefic 3 with the throne's tentacle things, strength 5, AP -2, and damage 3 there. Not bad, could certainly threaten some elite infantry, I guess. Otherwise, it retains its very good 2+ save against mortal wounds. It gives out the Herald reroll once to wound aura, casts 2 powers and can deny 2, and then its mirror type ability means that at the start of your opponent's command phase, you pick one enemy unit and roll 3d6 versus their leadership. If it beats it, then you get to half their movement and they get -1 to hit. I guess they get too busy looking in the mirror. Overall seems helpful enough if you want some casts of psychic powers that aren't on a Keeper of Secrets, plus it's at least somewhat tough, fairly fast, and has some combat. Next up, we've got the Transweaver, which is the new name for generic Herald of Slaanesh on foot, just 70 points and up from 55. Their stat line isn't quite on the same level as the Khorne Heralds, 5 attacks at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 2, and their toughness 4 with 4 wounds and a 5+4+ demon save. For 70 points though, their trio of buffs seems pretty good to me. They give out the Herald reroll once to wound aura, one Demonette core unit nominated in the command phase gets an extra AP -1, so AP 3 claws there, and also they can cast 1 power, maybe that Hysterical Frenzy one, to amp up the Demonettes even further. If you want to buff Demonette combat, then the standard Herald seems great. Very cheap for those 3 buffs, I think. Lastly, for Slaanesh, you can also field a Herald of Slaanesh on any one of the 3 flavours of Chariot. I must admit it is a bit weird having 6 flavours of Seeker Chariot in this book. Broadly speaking, all of them are kind of similar to the generic unit profiles. Rather than getting damage 1 attacks, they get damage 2, and they all hit on weapon skill 2, and get the character keyword, meaning that the Seeker Chariot and the Hellflayer won't be able to be shot directly due to Lookout Sir. Otherwise, besides that, they also add the Herald aura of reroll ones to wound, and they all cast 1 psychic power as well. Points wise, the standard Seeker Chariot is 100 points, the Hellflayer is 110, and the Exalted one is 120. I feel like probably the Exalted one isn't going to be the one to go for, seeing as it would allow you to be directly shot. I feel like perhaps the Hellflayer variant might be the most interesting. That gives you basically a Herald with the standard buffs, plus a nice boatload of strength 6 damage 2 attacks hitting on 2s. As well as this, they also give you +1 to hit for 1 core unit as well, that's delivered in the command phase. Overall, I do feel like maybe the Hellflayer one could be interesting if you want a Herald that's a lot fightier, and still does the same sort of things, albeit on a bigger base. Overall, I would say that Slaanesh is looking really quite strong in the book. Keepers of Secrets and Demonettes both seem excellent. The Chariots seem good value for cheap chaff and some annoying wounds and good anti-infantry. The Infernal and Rapturous does an awful lot of buffs for 80 points, and the generic Heralds are good as well. Back that up with some fairly good stratagems and a good psychic discipline, and I feel like Slaanesh is still in a very good place. Next up, let's change things up a bit and move on to the forces of Tzeentch and all the magic, warp, fire and mutation that they can bring. First up, we've got the Warlord traits. The Herald again can have the first 3, and the Lords of Change can have the rest, and quite a few of these seem pretty good. Born of Sorcery gives you +1 to cast, a very nice bonus, though admittedly Lords of Change do get a good cast already. Incorporeal Form gives you a -1 to wound, which is an excellent durability boost, could make the Lord of Change even more of a pain to deal with at range. Fractal Mind allows you to cast 1 power while also doing a psychic action. I'm not sure if you necessarily want to have your Lord of Change going around doing mental interrogate or anything. Even with this Warlord trait, you'd still be giving up 1 cast there. Warp Tether is a fun one to give the character the Warp Locus keyword, would allow some very close range scary deep strike there, and as an added benefit, it also allows reroll morale for nearby Tzeentch units within 12 inches. You could get the Warp Locus bits just by taking Kairos Fate Weaver's standard datasheet though, I suppose. Lawkeeper gives you a +6 inch range to psychic powers, though not the splash effects from Infernal Gateway, and Tyrant of the Warp means that you never perils and get a 5+ save against mortal wounds. Not terrible, but I don't think it's the best of these. Out of these options, Born of Sorcery for +1 to cast seems fine. In corporeal form it's a nice durability boost, that seems great as well, and Warp Tether for the Warp Locust does seem nice. Next up we've got the Tzeentch Relics, and the first is the Endless Grimoire. This one is basically a book that you can read. At the start of your shooting phase you can start doing this action, read the book until the next command phase, and if you successfully read your book then you learn a power from the Pandemoniac Discipline for the rest of the game. What's quite nice about this one is that it doesn't seem to prevent you moving or casting Psychic, which are probably going to be the most important things for those Tzeentch HQs. The Impossible Robe is a good one on a Lord of Change. Once per phase you get to change a failed save to damage 0, and it doesn't have to be the first one either, so you can save it until you get hit by something really big. I'm genuinely quite surprised that this is once per phase as opposed to once per turn, like at some other similar abilities, particularly on something like a Lord of Change that's going to make them massively tougher, particularly as they have a 3+ save against ranged attacks, so not much is going to be sneaking through. Really good, I'd still expect to see that on Lords of Change all over the place. Next up there's the Everstave, which fires and smites cast on a 9+ can't be denied. Not terrible, but also not that great I think. 9+ casts aren't going to be denied all that much anyway. Next there's the Warp Fire Blade. One combat weapon gets +1 damage and 6s to wound cause 1 mortal wound. Won't hurt on the Baleful Sword of a Lord of Change I suppose, but on the other hand most of the Tzeentch's forces tend to want to stay out of combat as their saves get rubbish there. Soulbane seems like it's a pretty interesting upgrade on a Rod of Sorcery for the Lord of Change. The Rod of Sorcery is now a shooting attack that you can get, hitting at Assault D6, Strength 6, AP -1 and Damage 2. And this one gives you 3d3 attacks, an extra pip of AP and an extra pip of damage, so a solid boost all the way around. Genuinely that's going to be quite meaningful shooting there. I guess if you've got a spare CP that you're not planning for other things then that could be worth it. Finally there's the Soul Eater Stave. Kill models with psychic powers to regenerate 1 wound on a 4+. If you've got a big damage dealer Lord of Change on the go using Infernal Gateway or the Bolt of Change, then that one seems like it's almost auto-include. You could be regenerating a lot of wounds there. You are limited to not being able to regenerate more than 6 wounds in a psychic phase, but even if you did that, it would probably have paid for itself then and there. Overall, solid relics. The Impossible Robe looks excellent on a Lord of Change, and the Soulbane Staff and the Soul Eater Stave both seem to be pretty good too. Next up we've got the Pandemoniac Discipline. This is the new name for Tzeentch's psychic powers. There's 6 powers to choose from, and generally they're fairly strong now. First up, Boon of Change is a buff that targets a unit within 18 inches. You roll a d3 and you randomly get either +2 inch movement, +1 strength or +1 toughness. If you cast the power on a 9+, then you get to choose, and that might be surprisingly doable with, say, a Lord of Change's +2 to cast. +1 toughness is going to be good on anything on objectives, and +1 strength could be handy on flamers or horrors, both of whom have their ranged attacks key off their strength. Bolt of Change is a great Witchfire, warp charge 7, 18 inches. You roll a massive 9d6, and for each 5+ you deal 1 mortal wound. That's an average of 3 mortal wounds straight away there, so that's pretty solid. But then you chase it down with even more mortal wounds if you kill enemy models, dealing an extra mortal wound for every model that you kill. It's going to be great whenever you cast it, but if you cast it against 1 wound infantry, then that's going to go to just the next level of value. Pretty much an auto-include spell in my book. Next up we've got Gaze of Fate for Warp Charge 7. This one's the one that allows you to retain 2 unspent Warpstorm points if you want to. Maybe not the strongest there, but I guess it could be handy if you've got more casts than you have psychic powers. I feel like maybe one of the issues with Tzeentch is they don't actually have that many psychic powers that you can cast. So between a couple of HQs you might already start to run out of spells on this discipline. Next there's Treason of Tzeentch, which is a Warp Charge 7 debuff against 1 unit within 18 inches. That unit can't be affected by auras. Some armies will care, some armies less so. Infernal Flames is a shooting buff, Warp Charge 7 and 18-inch range, and 1 core unit gets +1 to wound at range. Again, almost certainly going to be best on flamers there. They have great damage output, far more so than horrors in my opinion. Finally we've got Infernal Gateway, which is another absolutely excellent and very scary Witchfire. Warp Charge 8, so you probably want it on a Lord of Change for the +2 to cast, 18-inch range, and you target the closest enemy unit. That unit and each unit within 3 inches of them takes a big d3 mortal wounds, and if you luck out and cast it on a 12+, each unit takes 3 each. In theory, if you went for the Warlord trait plus had Tzeentch's Warpstorm effect, you might be casting on something like a +4, and that could mean getting the 3 each could be actually kind of doable. Pretty scary stuff if you do manage to line it up in such a way that the mortal wounds affect a lot of units. If the enemy is really bunched up, this could be massively painful. Overall, out of these, Bolt of Change and Infernal Gateway both seem great. Infernal Flames seems like the one that you want to go for buffing flamers. The others are maybe a bit more take or leave. We've got the Tzeentch Stratagems next. For 1 CP we've got Minions of Magic. Core Horrors Shooting, get 6s to wound, become AP -3. I'm not sure if the horror squads are going to have quite enough shooting for that to matter, to be honest. I guess if you need to punch a couple of wounds through against something really tough, then it could be worth the command point premium. For 1 or 2 CP we have Burning Warpfire. When Flamers shoots at a unit with 11 or more models, they get max shots. It's 4 CP if there's 4 or more Flamers. When that matters, that seems well worth the command points, though obviously your opponent needs to have a horde unit that you can target. For 1 CP we've got Warp Jaws. Screamers or Screamer attacks on the chariots get +1 to wound. That's just all around good, maybe on a 5 or 6 model Screamer unit. Quite a handy little option to flex into more damage output on the datasheet. Magical Boom for 1 CP is an extra cast, so if you really just want Smite to finish off an enemy unit, or you need to cast another Tzeentch power, always handy to have in the bag. There's 1 CP for extra relics, again no extra Warlord trait stratagem. There's quite a fun one called Warp Portal. A character making a normal move instead teleports anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from the enemy. It's 1 CP on the Heralds and 2 CP for Lords of Change. Really quite cool to have basically fairly godly repositioning there. Perhaps could be most fun for just lining up a massive amount of mortal wounds at the key part of the enemy army without having to worry about little things like whether or not you're in range. For 1 CP there's Flames of Mutation. Each slain horror in melee causes 1 mortal wound on enemies on a 6. Again, I would struggle to see how that's going to have enough damage to make it worth it. I guess perhaps if the opponent had something that was ridiculously fighty but only a few wounds left, maybe you could fish for some high damage. And finally there's an interesting one called Blasted Standard. This one's a horror icon one. Each time a Psyker casts a power on an unmodified 9 or more within 12 inches, the closest enemy to that standard takes 1 mortal wound. If you've got a fair few Psykers bunched up, then I guess that one could be worth a few more wounds belted down the field. If you're fishing for the 9s though, it does seem a bit more on the borderline side. Out of these ones, I feel like it's a bit of a mixed bag, maybe not a super overwhelming stratagem section overall. The extra cast is very nice. I think the Screamer's Warp Jaws one is good, and I really like the Warp Portal for teleporting a character around the board. Besides that, I think that they have some fairly marginal value. Moving on, let's get into the forces of Tzeentch, and starting with the Lord of Change. 300 points, which is the same as before, though on the stat line the war gear for the Lord of Change isn't free, unlike the rest of the greater demons. Stat line wise, he gets the extra wounds the same as the other greater demons. He does only hit on 3s now, so not maybe quite as mighty at range or melee. And interestingly, Tzeentch units generally have a 3+ save against ranged attacks, but a very bad save against melee. The Lord of Change is on the upper end of that at a 5+, but most of the rest of the units only get a 6. It does mean that Tzeentch armies are going to have some very good or bad matchups depending on whether their foes are range or melee. If they're fighting a foe that relies on ranged attacks, then they're generally going to have a very good time, whereas if they're fighting a foe that relies on combat attacks, their units might fall apart pretty quickly. I'd guess that pure Tzeentch might not be the way that people choose to go, maybe a mix of them and other gods. Weapons wise, it attacks with the Staff of Tzeentch. 5 attacks hitting on 3s at strength 6, AP -2, damage 3, and then you've got the option of taking either a Rod of Sorcery or a Baleful Sword. Both of them cost 10 points. The Rod gives you that shooting attack, d6 shots at strength 6, AP -1, damage 2. Sorry, not damage 1 were there, that's a small typo. And it doesn't auto hit the enemy, it's not like a flamer or anything. Otherwise there's the Baleful Sword for plus 10 points. That one gives you +1 strength, AP 3 and damage 3 melee, and it's also Malefic 3 as well, so you get those attacks in addition to the Staff of Tzeentch ones, not instead of. They both seem fine to be honest. For raw damage the Baleful Sword is much better, but it depends on whether or not you want to have your Lord of Change just avoiding combat like the plague, as they'll be easier to kill there. For their special rules, the biggest change for the datasheet is that they now cast 3 powers at base rather than 2. I did find it a bit on the sad side that one of the best Psykers in the game could only cast 2 spells, so now he's plugging away with 3 of them and does get a +2 to cast at base, dropping down to a +1 to cast if he's 9 wounds or less. As a greater demon, he also gives the reroll 1s for Tzeentch core units within 6 inches. Finally, we've got the 3 Exalted Lord of Change upgrades. The first one is Architect of Deception. 35 points for -1 to hit both at range and in melee. A nice durability boost, that one seems fine if you just want to have him flying around and avoiding things, I suppose. I think most people are going to struggle to chew through 20 wounds of toughness 7, plus a -1 to hit and the 3+ save. Master Mutator is a 30-point one. At the end of the psychic phase, you roll 1d6 per unit that lost wounds to psychic powers that this model cast. On a 2+, each one takes 1 mortal wound. That one could easily be worth a few mortal wounds per turn. Ideally, I guess you want to spread out the mortal wounds across multiple units, so having this combined with Infernal Gateway seems like a bit of a no-brainer. If you can splash around loads of mortal wounds with Infernal Gateway, you could easily be getting something like 5 mortal wounds a turn out of this if the stars align. Finally, we've got Nexus of Fate, 20 points for a 4+ chance to gain 1 CP each command phase. One of the few ways that demons have to gain more command points. This one seems fine enough to me if you're not using either of the other two. I'd say the Master Mutator one seems like perhaps the strongest combined with Infernal Gateway, though the other two are both fine, maybe on a second Lord of Change, though I do feel you get into diminishing returns due to having used up the good powers on the discipline. Moving on to the other Tzeentch units next, and first up we have the Horrors. They're a unit that's been altered really quite a lot. 150 points for 10 now, all the way up from 80. You can't take more or less, and you're in the weird situation of paying for a whole ton of durability, as they now have other horrors baked into them. Statline changes, they now hit on 3s, and get that Tzeentch save of a 3+ versus range, but a 6+ versus melee, so very hard to shift with shooting, but very easy to kill with blades. And their coruscating fire now comes at strength 4, just as standard, AP -1 and damage 1, 2 shots at 18 inches. Unfortunately, because you're paying for the splitting horrors, it does mean that horrors just basically aren't ever going to be an efficient damage dealing unit. For 150 points, 20 shots at strength 4 AP -1 just isn't that standout, even with some of the buffs that you can access. I think I'd probably more treat any range damage as a bit of a nice extra on a very durable unit, at least versus range anyway. That split rule is really quite good fun though. Each time a horror dies, you roll a dice, and on a 4+, slain pink horrors split into 2 blue horrors, so you are likely going to be generating 1 blue horror per pink horror in the unit, and then those blue horrors even have the chance to split into brimstone horrors as well, again on a 4+, though you only get 1 base as there's 2 brims per base. It means that in reality your 150-point horror squad is actually representative of a 25 model unit. Even in combat, they will be deceptively hard to chew through. Interestingly, you can still fill blue horrors as their own datasheet still, 70 points, again locked to a unit size of 10, and they're kind of similar to pinks, but worse in several key ways. They hit on 5s and 4s, are only strength 2, and only get a 4+ save at range, and the strength 2 does mean that their fire is weaker, only coming out at strength 3. Brimstones are similar to this again, but only strength 1, leadership 4, and only a 5+ save versus range, so they're not really going to be good for all that much, just besides being cheap chaff. Blue horrors will be really excellent as the cheapest troops choice in the book, though unfortunately they can't do actions and don't get Auspex. Perhaps the biggest advantage of blue horrors is that they are cheap and fill troop slots, so if you just want a Tzeentch detachment with minimal investment and you don't want to bother shelling out for 150 points worth of pinks, then they're an option. It also means that if there's only blues and brimstone horrors in a unit, then the pink horror unit can't do actions and loses objective secured. Seems fairly possible though that you'd just be able to keep 1 pink horror alive until just about the last thing, until that one eventually splits or doesn't. Brimstone horrors as their own unit have gone away though, you can't take them individually anymore. They only manifest as a result of splitting blues or pinks. Overall, I'm genuinely not sure exactly how strong horrors are going to be at the moment. They cost a lot of points for very little damage output, but will be crazily hard to shift at range, but less so in melee, even if they have lots of wounds. I guess parking a unit of pinks on an objective would make it so your opponent has to do some good work to get them off it, plus you might be able to get some movement shenanigans with the split things. Otherwise though, Tzeentch has plenty of other good stuff. I'd say perhaps one of the most standout units for them would be the Flamers, which seem exceptionally good for the 25 points that they cost now. You can only run them in units of 3 to 6, so a few less than previously, but they've got some massive slackline buffs, and their flames have got very nasty. The Flamers themselves have got to become weapon skill 4+, their strength 5, 3 wounds and 3 attacks now, and again get the Tzeentch 6+3+ save. The nastiest things though are their Flamers. They're a massive d6+3 shots each now, strength user AP -2 and damage 1, so even in a minimum size unit that's a pretty brutal amount of auto hits, all at strength 5 and AP -2, potentially getting better if you've got buffs for them. They are core, they can fly, and they're fast moving infantry, so they look pretty great overall. It seems like it's pretty hard to go wrong with 3 of these for 75 points, flying around and averaging something like 18 hits at strength 5, AP -2 on light infantry units. If you're running Tzeentch, I see no reason why you wouldn't take these. They're far more dangerous if you want actual damage dealers at range compared with horrors. If you want to buff them, there's a 75 point Exalted Flamer, up 15 points from 60. His stat line has got generally a little bit better across the board. He's a toughness 5, 5 wound character, and his flames come out at a strength of 6. You can either fire the pink fire for 2d6 strength 6 AP2 hits, or the blue fire for 3 shots at 18 inches, strength 9 AP4 and damage 3, so he can put in a little bit of anti-tank ranged punch. He can't take warlord traits and relics, but his main ability is to get +1 strength for the flamers. It means that you could have strength 6 flames for wounding things like orcs or custodes on a 3 rather than a 4. Next up we've got the Screamers, 30 points up from 26. Tzeentch's fast moving combat unit, a huge 16 inches, hit on 4s, their strength and toughness 4, and now have got both 3 wounds and 3 attacks, so are a bit meatier and harder to take down. For a melee unit though, that 6+ to save in combat is going to hurt them. Combat units should kill them pretty easily. Their melee is still strength +2, AP3 and damage 2. They've got the ability to advance and teleport anywhere on the board if they can't make a charge, though to be honest, with a 16-inch movement they're going to get where they need to go very easily indeed. Their slash attacks for moving across enemy units have a 4+ chance to deal immortal wounds per unit in the squad, and they are a core unit so can get some buffs. Overall, I still think that they seem kind of useful just for their sheer speed, though I must admit having the 6+ save in combat seems really annoying. They'll have to be very careful and maybe just make sure they take out outlying enemy units where they aren't going to get countercharged, maybe making some good use of that 1 CP stratagem for +1 to wound. Finally, for the more battle line type Tzeentch units, we've got the Burning Chariot. This one's 120 points, up from 110, and it's fast moving at 14 inches, hits on 3s at range, toughness 6 and 9 wounds, and actually has a good save where Tzeentch is concerned, saving on a 4+ both at range and in combat. Basically this thing is kind of a daze for an Exalted Flamer. You get the option of the blue and pink fire as before. You get the +1 strength aura for flamers, so it's another way of delivering that, though it doesn't have the character keyword, meaning that it could be shot directly. Otherwise, the Screamers that are attached to it get 6 attacks at strength 6 AP3 damage 2, so it's actually reasonably good in melee as well. And if you want, you can pay an extra 5 points for some attendant horrors, giving you a -1 to cast within 12 inches. It's got the vehicle keyword now, and it isn't core. Seems alright, an okay mix of range and melee I suppose. I guess a trio of these could be pretty annoying with their decent saves. Maybe could give something for Tzeentch to put on objectives and not have to worry quite so much about a melee unit just straight up removing them. Finally we get into the HQ and character choices for Tzeentch. Their unique Lord of Change is Kairos Fateweaver, 320 points up from 270, and is a Lord of Change with +2 wounds. He's got the Staff of Tomorrow for a +2 strength, AP3 and damage 2d3, so slightly better combat than the base Lord of Change, though it's a bit closer if you take the blade. He does have the Warp Locus, so quite nice on a fast moving unit. You can rustle up some flamers out of the blue I suppose. And other than that, he's got 2 big draws to him, +1 to cast for each battle round so far, so only +1 to cast in the first battle round, we're going up to a crazy +5 by the end. I guess quite a nice one for any of the higher value powers like Infernal Gateway. He also has the ability to make 1 stratagem for the enemy army +1 command point. That happens after they've used it and only affects future uses of the stratagem. So say Space Marines use transhuman physiology, from then on you can make it cost 2 CP rather than 1. Finally he casts and denies 3, but no longer grants any command points to the army. Overall he seems okay for just 20 points more than a standard Lord of Change. I guess you might have to weigh up whether or not you want the extra damage from that Master Mutator Exalted trait, and I feel like with the Impossible Robe as well, a standard Lord of Change is probably going to be a bit more efficient than this guy. Still though, it certainly doesn't seem terrible. Some fun and powerful special rules that you don't really get elsewhere easily. The Changeling is next, the character herald for 100 points, down from 105. He's got toughness 5, 5 wounds, and a 5+3+ demon save. Arguably I'd say he's got a little bit worse. In combat he still gets to copy an enemy infantry model's stats, so hit them back as hard as they can hit. And in terms of buffs, he can still cast a power and does the herald reroll once to wound. He did lose his 6+ Feel No Pain aura though, which I thought was maybe one of the best things about him. I feel like in general people are more likely to run the other heralds at the moment. Otherwise, here we've got the 3 more generic heralds. The Fate Skimmer is the one that's mounted on essentially the Screamer Chariot. He's 140 points down from 160 and has a very similar profile to the Burning Chariot of Tzeentch. This one gets a 3+ save against ranged attacks though, and has the character keyword so it can't be shot directly if you're protected by Lookout Sir. Perhaps the most interesting thing for this one is that it gained a good shooting option. You can take a Staff of Change, which seems like an auto-include for 5 points, an 18-inch attack at Assault 3, Strength +4, AP -4 and Damage 2. I see no reason why you wouldn't take that. Its melee is a measly AP -1 damage 1, but the Screamers still get their Malefic 6 attacks. This one can also take the Horror Retinue for the -1 to cast debuff. He casts 2 powers like the other generic heralds here, and also comes with Herald rerolls of 1 to wound, and can buff one Screamer unit with 6s to hit auto wound in combat. Seems reasonable enough, some fast moving Psychic if you don't want to shell out for a whole Lord of Change, particularly if you're buffing Screamers. Next up there's the Fluxmaster, 110 points up from 105. This one is the Herald on the disc. He's gains Toughness 4, 6 wounds, and again the Tzeentch saves. The disc blades for discs of Tzeentch give you Malefic 1, Strength 4, and Damage 1 attacks, plus that weak dagger. He does Herald rerolls, plus makes one horror unit give 6s to hit auto wound at range, and again he basically has that auto include Staff of Change as well. Again he casts 2 powers. I think just on a raw stat line basis he seems a bit weaker than the Fate Skimmer. If you're already shelling out for the mobility, it might just be worth upgrading to the entire big chariot thing. At least that way you get a lot more durability and also Screamer attacks. I guess this one is a bit more relevant if you're thinking about buffing horror shooting though, not that I'm certain that that's a good idea. Finally there's the Changecaster, kind of similar to the Fluxmaster but a bit cheaper and not on a disc. 80 points down from 85, also can take that staff. He's Toughness 4 and 5 wounds, and again provides the Herald rerolls, 2 powers, and then weirdly buffs horrors in melee with 6s to hit auto wounds. Seems a very weird choice to the extent where I wonder whether it might be a typo or not. Horrors just don't really do melee that much with just one attack at strength 3, so buffing them there seems super pointless. Still though, if you just want raw Tzeentch powers like unleashing those 2 powerful witch fires just for getting 80 points in your army, it seems like he could actually be pretty scary in a mixed demons list. Finally we've got the last of the unique heralds, which I couldn't quite fit on the last slide. We've got the Blue Scribes, who are still 90 points, a little tougher at Toughness 4, 5 wounds, and a 3+5+ save, terrible melee, and again they do a bit of auto casting and debuffing enemy psychic. They give enemies a -1 to cast within 12 inches, and if a psyker fails to cast a spell within that range then it just goes for good. That could put a spanner in the works for things like Grey Knights, Thousand Suns, or maybe other Chaos Demon players with greater demons, maybe units they don't really want to drop back from this, but on the other hand they really can't afford to lose those spells. Otherwise you still randomly auto-cast one Tzeentch spell, roll a d6 on the table, and you just get that automatically, it can't be denied. If they siphoned a spell, it can also cast Smite as well. I feel like these guys are maybe just a little bit random and too costly to be relied on that much. Definitely a fun unit to have in the army, and every so often they'll manifest something like Bolt of Change and Infernal Gateway, but a lot of the time they might be getting something that's just not in the right position or a bit more useless. Overall, Tzeentch seems to be one of the weirdest and most skewed of the Demon's forces. I feel like they're going to be far stronger when combined with other Chaos allies or with other demons. Flamers seem absolutely amazing, horrors do seem annoying to remove at range, and the Psychic seems very good as well. Maybe just you get into diminishing returns though once you've used up the good powers on the discipline, so there's not really as much point in taking more casters. I think they'll also just really want to combine with something that's just not going to die in melee instantly. That just doesn't seem like a productive way to try and hold the midfield objectives. Moving onwards, next we come to the Book of the Warp. This is the area for the non-god aligned things, or the ones that can take the marks of different gods. First up we've got the Demon Prince of Chaos and the Soul Grinder, and then we'll talk about Be'lakor, his army, and also the Chaos Demon secondaries in the chapter approved. The Demon Prince of Chaos is 140 points base, down from 150. Its stat line is largely the same, and is boosted by which allegiance you give it. A pretty meaty and scary Chaos character though, hitting on 2s, Toughness 6 and 8 wounds with a 4+5+ save, and Strength 7 with a big 6 attacks. He must be upgraded to be from one of the Chaos Gods, and gets their buff for free. Khorne gives him +1 strength and 2 attacks, but no psychic. Nurgle gives him a toughness to toughness 7 and 1 cast. Slaanesh gives him an extra 2-inch move and 1 cast as well, and Tzeentch doubles down on the psychic, knowing 2 casts and 1 extra power. Otherwise, you've got the standard option to give him wings for 35 points for flying a 12-inch move, usually going to be worth it, and melee is basically the same as the Demon Prince from the Chaos Space Marine Codex. The axe and the sword are both 10 points each. I think usually it's going to be worth upgrading to the sword for strength 8, AP 3 and flat 3 damage. Otherwise he rerolls hit rolls of 1 and could be an interesting choice for various relics and warlord traits. It's just a generally strong and fighty character, though maybe not quite on the same level as the greater demons. A bit of an all-rounder, can certainly be a scary threat but gets character protection. Otherwise, for the other unaligned datasheets, we have the Soul Grinder, 190 points, so up a fair bit from 160, but I think that they have got a lot better. First up, they hit on 3s now, which is quite nice. They've gone up to Strength and Toughness 8 and a big 16 wounds, so are really quite hard to shift. They've got 5 attacks and a demon save of 4+5+. The 4+ save against range again will help them. Like the Demon Prince, you get some various different buffs depending on your allegiance. Khorne gives you an extra 2 attacks, which is nice. Nurgles maybe particularly stand out, going all the way up to the fabled toughness of 9. Games Workshop seems to be letting that out the bag a bit more, with Chaos Land Raiders, Great Unclean Ones and these. Slaanesh has a very helpful extra 4-inch move, so it's a lot more likely to make melee. And Tzeentch gives you extra durability in combat, which seems weird given the rest of the army, a 4+ save at range and in melee, so meaning that the Soul Grinder I guess could be a fairly decent durability option for Tzeentch forces. In general, it's got a fairly solid range and combat damage. At base it comes with the Iron Claw, which it makes most of its attacks at. Its strength 16, AP 3 and damage D6 will be good against heavy hitters, particularly anything that relies on a high toughness like knights. Plus then you either get to choose the Warp Sword or the Malefic Talon in the other hand. The Warp Claw gives you an extra 4 Malefic attacks at strength user AP 2 and damage 2, or the Warp Sword gives you an extra 2 attacks at strength user AP 3 and damage D3+3. Both seem kind of fine to be honest. It depends on whether or not you want to make it a bit more usable against infantry or double down on killing heavies. Finally, they all come with 2 different ranged attacks as well. The Harvester Cannon gets you 6 shots at 36 inches at an autocannon profile, plus you also get the Phlegm Bombardment at 36 inches, D6 shots at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3. I think to make use of it you do have to get the most out of the range and the melee. In general though, as demon units just slogging up the board, taking damage and trying to deal with a few of the hardest hitting enemies, it actually seems like the Soul Grinder is pretty usable for that role with this big toughness profile. I think Nurgle's going to particularly like them for that reason, but I do like that extra Slaanesh movement too, and Khorne and Tzeentch seem usable as well. Finally, our last Undivided datasheet, and the biggest and baddest in the book, we have Be'lakor. He's 420 points, and doesn't have to choose between his gods because he has all of them in one. He's an HQ choice, as well as a Supreme Commander for the faction, so he isn't going to limit your HQ choices. He can be in a Supreme Command attachment if you like. Keywords wise, he's got all the god-specific keywords for stratagems and things, plus has the Warp Locus keyword, and having every god's keyword it means that he can be manifesting anything from bloodletters to flamers and get them right in and next to the enemy. And on a fast moving and very scary model on his own right, that's a very nice thing to have. Be'lakor kind of already had a 9th edition datasheet as it came out in that expansion a little while back. He does have a good stat line at 12-inch move, hitting on 2s, strength 8 and toughness 7, 20 wounds now, 6 attacks, and a 4+ save at range and in melee. The main gains that is made there are gaining wounds. In combat, his power is basically unchanged, strength +4, AP 4 and damage D3+3, ignoring invul saves. Great for chewing through the enemy's brightest and best, and an anti-horde mode with double the attacks at strength user AP 3 and damage 1. Abilities wise, again he has a lot going on. His durability rules have got amped up even further. He's -1 to hit and wound all the time, range and melee now. You can't reroll hit rolls against him, again range and melee, and also against range he's -1 damage as well, meaning that this guy is just remarkably hard to shoot to death. Between that and the extra wounds gained, I believe his durability has gone up by something like 60% or so against a lot of common attacks, and that's pretty terrifying given how threatening he is. Otherwise, he gives you a reroll hit roll of 1 for all Legions Demonica units, just not vehicles. Interesting that he commands basically anything, whether it's core or not. He can't be taken in the same detachment as other Demon Princes, as he gets jealous apparently. He's got an extra inbuilt aura of 6 inches of -1 leadership and -1 combat attrition, so that would stack very nicely with the standard demon terror things, so models are going to be fleeing really easily near him. And as previously, he casts 2 Noctic powers, which are broadly quite similar. His Warlord trait is also listed here as well. Shadow Lord for 1 core unit within 9 inches, re-rolling or hit rolls. A very nice generic buff power, that one. Depending on what you actually want your Warlord to do, could be a very reasonable choice for one. Overall, he seems very strong, massively tough, massively dangerous, and gaining other useful things like Warp Locus. I feel like Be'lakor is still going to be in a lot of strong Chaos Demon lists. Next up, we'll mention his psychic powers, which he can also use in his own Army of Renown that we'll get onto in just a second. Most of the powers are basically unchanged from what they were before. The big differences are that Shrouded Step and the Wreathed in Shade ones can be used on any Legion's Demonica units, not just ones from Disciples of Be'lakor, so it actually means that Be'lakor might want to take these in an army that isn't the Disciples now. First up, Shrouded Step is Warp Charge 6 and 18 inches, basically teleport 1 infantry unit anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from the enemy. A nice way to get some first turn deep strike action. Doing something like just ramming a whole load of flamers down the enemy's throats doesn't seem like the worst idea. I guess you could use it to get onto objectives and things, and could also be handy. Wreathed in Shades is Warp Charge 7 and 12-inch range. It means that the unit that you target can't be shot unless it's the closest unit or less than 12 inches away. You can't use that on monsters or vehicles, and can be a good way to protect exposed units on objectives. Pall of Despair is a Warp Charge 7 debuff. You target 1 enemy unit within 18 inches, you roll 3d6 versus their leadership, and if you score higher then you choose one of these 3 powerful debuffs. One is lose 1 aura for a turn, the other is stop actions, and the last is fights last, always handy to have to control the fight phase. Now with army-wide -1 to leadership, that one becomes a bit better. Void Slivers is Warp Charge 5, 12-inch range, and you draw a line of that distance. You get 1 mortal wound for each unit that you crossed, or d3 mortal wounds for a unit of 11 plus models. A pretty bad Witchfire, to be honest. Now the buffs are more de-restricted, I think you're going to be better off with something like Shrouded Step. Penumbral Curse is Warp Charge 7 and 18-inch range. It's -1 to wound and -1 AP in melee for the unit that you target. The -1 to wound thing really is quite big on a good combat unit. Interestingly, the AP debuff actually doesn't make any difference whatsoever against demons, but I guess it could help out any Heretic Astartes friends that you bring along. Finally, Betraying Shades is kind of similar. Warp Charge 6 and 18-inch range. Add the attacks of 6 different models together. Roll 1d6 for each one of those numbers, and each 6+ deals a mortal wound. If you cast on an 11+, then it happens on a 5+ instead. Pretty good on a really big threatening unit with loads of attacks, a bit mediocre otherwise. Overall, some really solid powers there. Shrouded Step just seems like another great way to get more mobility around the board, particularly on turn 1. The other debuffs all seem usable, if potentially a bit situational. The Witchfires I'm a bit underwhelmed with, though I'd say that the Betraying Shades is by far the better of the two. Could be handy against some targets like Terminators perhaps. Speaking of Be'lakor and Noctic things, the book does include the Disciples of Be'lakor Army of Renown, basically an army-wide set of special rules that allows you to field a mixed force of demons and Be'lakor allies, usually some Chaos Space Marines and maybe a Chaos Knight. It's really quite a dense page of rules, a whole bunch of restrictions, and then a few benefits. On the restrictions side, lots of things just are completely out for numerous codexes. Be'lakor must be the warlord, you can take no greater demons, demon princes, demon engines, none of the god-specific chaos legions like Emperor's Children or World Eaters. The only Chaos Knight that you can take is a single Korvax one, and you can't take any Cult Marines like Khorne Berserkers or Rubric Marines, even if they hail from another legion. Otherwise, you can't mix Demons and Traitores Astartes in the same detachment, they still have to be separate, so you're going to be paying some CP there. The Traitores Astartes can't take Marks of Chaos, and they can't use any Legion-specific options either. And on the Demons side, you have to field a mix of the different gods units. You can't say take all Slaanesh if you wanted to. You can't take a second Chaos Demons unit of the same god before you've taken one of each, and the same for a third. For all that though, you do get some payoffs. Chaos Space Marines gain the Disciples of Shadow special rule, +1 to their combat attrition tests and -1 to hit at 12 inches. Everyone gains the Disciples of Be'lakor keywords, plus specific ones for the Demons and the Chaos Marines. All troops gain Obsec. Interestingly, there's no mention that the Nurglings don't gain an Obsec here. I don't know if that supersedes the rule earlier in the book. And perhaps for the most important things, you gain the Disciples of Be'lakor stratagems. You can draw powers from the Noctic Discipline, and it allows you to use Warpstorm even if Chaos Space Marines are present. In general, I basically say the main draw are the stratagems and Noctic, plus the ability for relatively free and easy Demon and Chaos allies. We've already covered the Noctic Discipline, so let's talk stratagems. For 1 CP we've got Shadow Pact. A Chaos Space Marine infantry unit in the command phase gets to choose either +1 attack, a 5+ invul, +1 toughness, or +1 to their move, advance, or charge. +1 toughness seems quite nice to me. For 1 CP there's Demonic Boon. A non-vehicle Chaos Marine unit that's less than 6 inches from a Chaos Demons unit gets +1 strength and 6s to hit in melee auto wounds. Two very nice combat buffs for just the 1 CP there, though I guess the positioning does have to be right. For 1 CP we've got Legions of Shade. It allows you to move or charge through enemy models this phase. That's very nice on anything that can't interact very well with ruins, say like the Demon Cavalry perhaps. For 2 CP there's Mortal Boon. Chaos Demon units that are less than 6 inches from non-vehicle Chaos Space Marine units can auto-pass morale with an unmodified 1. Maybe that's the demons feeding off the Mortal's resolve or something. Could be handy if you're just about to take some morale casualties, I suppose. For 1 CP there's Draft of Terror. Chaos Demons units get healed when enemies flee within 6 inches. Use this one at the start of the morale phase, so I guess it's liable for your opponent to counter it for 2 CP. But basically if the enemy did lose a fair few models fleeing, then you could regain quite a lot of wounds that way. Anything that's big, tough and dangerous would like that quite a lot. Finally for 2 CP we have Blessing of Be'lakor, which is quite a nice one. Be'lakor does actually have to be on the board to use this one, but after you've failed a saving throw for any Disciples of Be'lakor unit, you can then change that damage output to a 0. Very nice if you had something horrible like a huge damage 3d3 shot go through or something. That one's very good, but does cost 2 CP. Overall they seem handy enough. I do feel like you're trading off really quite a lot of good stuff from the Demons Codex to get stuff here though, and my guess would be that it's probably going to make more sense just to field Be'lakor alongside a standard Chaos Demons army, rather than taking all the benefits and trade-offs of Disciples of Be'lakor. Still though, certainly a fun and fluffy way if you want to run an extra terrifying and shadowy Chaos Demons and Heretic Astartes force. Finally, I thought we'd just cover the unique secondary objectives for the Demons Codex. As I mentioned earlier, these aren't technically actually in the book. They're in Warzone Nephilim, so maybe they're being reprinted there just so they'll be able to update them with new ones when updates happen. Worth mentioning at the moment though, as it's quite an important part of several games of 40k if you're using them. Out of these, I'd say that Reality Rebels is easily the best. This one's a Battlefield Supremacy one, and the game is to have more Demons units in each table quarter than other enemy units at the end of your turn, and you get 1 victory point for each. This one's really easily done. You should be able to farm that in your own deployment zone all game long for a pretty much guaranteed 5. It really doesn't take too much effort to achieve that in another quarter, and on top of that you also get an extra victory point for having 1 Demons unit within 6 inches of the centre of the board. Provided things are at least in some way even on the table, you should easily be able to score very high on that. Otherwise, there's Despoilers of Reality, a Shadow Ops one that allows you to do actions on midfield objectives. You need infantry models to do it, and it's one of those actions that happens in your turn but only completes at the start of your next command phase, meaning that enemy units will have a chance to gun down your infantry while they're doing it. It's 4 victory points per objective despoiled in this way. It does compete with things like Raise the Banners, which would allow you to do one inside your own deployment zone too. I guess the advantage of this one is that you could achieve the objectives quite quickly towards the end of the game if you were massively on top. Finally, we've got Nourished by Terror, a No Mercy No Respite one. Every enemy model fleeing scores you 1 victory point, kind of a big swing one as to whether or not you can make them fail leadership tests, but if the enemy does have a whole ton of models that are vulnerable to morale, -1 leadership and -1 combat attrition could rack this up quite quickly. On top of the fleeing models, if you kill a unit with a Demons unit, you roll 2d6 versus their leadership, and if you roll greater or equal, then you also gain a victory point from that. If the enemy's got lots of big blocky units that you think you can force to fail morale, then it seems good. Going to be crazily useless against some higher leadership or low model count armies though. Overall, out of these, Reality Rebels is the best I think. Despoilers of Reality probably isn't any better than Banners, and Nourished by Terror is situationally good. And with unique secondaries out the way, that's just about us done for our big review of the Chaos Demons Codex. Overall, I must admit the book has really quite a lot of interesting stuff, some bits that seem incredibly powerful, but perhaps some bits that do feel a bit on the underpowered side, It's annoying being locked to one warlord trait when there's 25 in the book, and the division of stratagems between the different gods seems pretty annoying, particularly Khorne who only gets 6, and not even particularly good ones. Overall though, it does feel like a massive power boost to demons of lots of flavours. The greater demons I'm sure will still be out in good force seeing as they're not limited. For Khorne I quite like the idea of easy deep striking bloodletters, could be a good way to get them to combat and cause massive damage with damage 2 Hellblades. For Nurgle, I think maybe their beasts and plague drones are some of the most interesting things. Very tough, the plague drones can deal decent damage, and beasts just look super annoying with that regeneration rule. I think Slaanesh is just looking generally strong. Demonettes may be one of the strongest lesser demon units, loads of great buffs freely available, and a whole stack of attacks and fast movement. The psychic powers and the Slaanesh stratagems seem really good, and keepers racing across the board still looks like it's pretty viable to me on paper. Finally, Tzeentch I think is a bit of a mixed bag. As I was saying before, maybe it isn't quite as tempting to field an entire army of, maybe a chunk of army allied perhaps with Thousand Sons or Chaos Marines, or alongside another deity's demon units perhaps. The sheer amount of mortal wounds that you can get out of their magic seems good though, as do flamers. For 25 points the sheer amount of burning that they can put out seems amazing. I'm sure plenty of people will be looking forward to adding them as allies to their Chaos Marines or Knights. A couple of command points for a patrol isn't amazing in Nephilim, but it can allow you some powerful options and units that function in a very different way to the ones already in your book. Overall seems like a fun and scary codex. Demon saves and those scary deep strikes I'm sure will intimidate people. I'm sure that we'll see people having some good success with them at a competitive level. In any case, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've spotted any errors, feel free to let me know as well. I'll try and post them in a pinned comment if anything major got through. And I'll certainly hope to do a few more demon videos in the next few weeks and months. I'll certainly make a Codex unit tier list, and probably plenty of other stuff besides. Might be fun to look at a few cool combos. In any case, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I will review Games Workshop's news and releases as they come out. Finally, if you have enjoyed this super big effort video, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that down in the video description. If you've found all the effort that went into making this useful, any support is enormously appreciated. A fair amount of no sleep has been expended in the making of this review. If you would like to support new videos coming, the link's down in the video description. I do try and give some decent benefits for patrons as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, feel free to check it out down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, all praise to the ruinous powers, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.